Okay. I think this should disappear. I hope. Hold on. I hope it does. And then I think the arrows should be just fine. Great. Good morning, everybody. I think you can probably hear me without the microphone. I'm Lisa LaFontaine. I am the CEO of the Humane Rescue Alliance, which is the animal welfare organization here in DC. And we have a number of programs and services, veterinary hospital, officers, programs and services. But I'm here today to introduce this presentation and this project, which is all about cat counting and specifically, I'm going to talk about the DC cat count. And what I want to do is just lay the groundwork for the project and the governing committee and how it worked, because I think that was really important in driving the science. We really invested in the early days in setting up our goals and our ground rules so that we could bring people who don't necessarily work together around the table to talk about counting cats. So it is not. Perfect. There we go. So I'm going to let each of my co-presenters introduce themselves when they get here. And really, the groundwork I want to lay today is that we're trying to present a new paradigm for urban cat management. And we're going to talk to you about this project that was a 3-year project. And each person on this panel played a different role in that. So the most important things for us, because, you know, I had never had an experience of working collaboratively like this with a group made up of conservation biologists, wildlife folks, bird folks, cat folks, scientists. And I think that the project was just as important for that collaboration model that we established to allow everybody to converse and work together as anything else. And we really spent time on that because we knew that would be critical for anybody else who wanted to adopt a similar project to this. And so we really focused around shared goals because we knew there was all kinds of ground where we might disagree. But if we could just establish the shared goals that we had, that could serve as a touch point that we could always revisit throughout the life of the project. It was very important to us to use data for long-term planning. And I can talk for our organization. We had a community cat program for many years. And we were fortunate in that it was pretty well funded. And so we could do a lot of TNR work. But I had come to feel that we were just not collecting data to justify or allow us to make the very best use of the resources we were putting into the program. And so using this to plan resource allocation, priorities, decisions was really important. Adaptive management was critical, as was looking at all the programmatic synergies that we could have. For us, we were doing TNR, we were doing access to care, all sorts of things. And because we're the only animal welfare organization in the city, we were able to have all those programs under one roof and collect years of data that actually preceded this project. So this could have been seeded in a lot of places. And I know that for the funders, it was important to nest it here in Washington and with the Humane Rescue Alliance. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about why here and why HRA. So our organization serves all animals, all species. I don't think there's an animal you could name that we have not either had temporarily in our care or cared for out in the field. We serve wild animals, birds, farm animals. Sometimes we help out with animals who've escaped from the National Zoo, dogs and cats. And I think that's really important because we value all species. We're not We're not a traditional humane society that's only about companion animals. We have a responsibility for all the species in this city. And as you can see, there's a lot of green space and there are diverse animal life. Our organization also is funded by really diverse stakeholders. So we have people holding us accountable for caring for each species and valuing each species. And so it's always a constant balancing act for us to make sure that we're not making a decision for one group of animals that's going to harm another group of animals. And there are always tensions when you have to make those choices. But we're very serious about our broad responsibility and making the best choice that we can to help the most and hurt the least. We also have the animal services contract. And I think so that means that we're the animal control provider for the District of Columbia. And that's really how we have a lot of our wildlife encounters. You can imagine just from having seen the city, you can imagine all the situations that wild animals can get themselves into. We have a lot of green space in this city, and we also have dense populations. And so we are usually the first call for most wildlife issues. And then I think it's very important that our team, they live here in this community. This ecosystem is where we play and we go for recreation and where we live. And we value the whole ecosystem. And I think that helped us really activate citizen scientists who live here to help us with this program. So why Washington? I'll never forget when I was coming for my interview for this job, and I was just struck looking at all the green spaces here. And even though we're in an urban part of town now, I was just telling Tyler, one of my co-presenters, that I live across the street here in Washington from a 55-acre federally protected park. And I think that I see more wild animals here than I did when I lived up in New England in a suburban area. And so this was a very interesting laboratory because we have dense neighborhoods. We have a lot of alleyways where people live together and are caring for cats as a neighborhood. We have green space, we have 2 rivers, and there's just a lot to offer. And I think maybe most importantly of all, it's 8 miles east to west and north to south. So it's a very finite area in which to count cats and do this science. And our organization had had years of data, both from the animal sheltering system, but also community related data that we could at least build on. It wasn't anywhere near sufficient. It wasn't robust, but it was a start. And then finally, Daniel and I, we met in 2007 because Danielle was a key part of the community cat program and ran it for many years for the Washington Humane Society and Humane Rescue Alliance. And she had built an amazing network of caregivers and community cat activists who are advocates who were really making sure that there was good care, responsible care, and that people were communicating and talking. And we had, as I mentioned, a fair number of resources dedicated to the program. So we were spaying and neutering a lot of cats. So another reason that this was important to us, I just want to call out this excerpt from DC law from 1929, and I'll just read it to you. Section 8, that hereafter the pound master shall seize all cats found running at large and convey the same to the pound or other place to be designated by the commissioners and there destroyed. Any citizen may deliver any such animal to the pound master, who shall destroy the same as above required. And so from 1929 until 2009, there had been no appreciable decrease, and in fact, an increase in the outdoor cat population. So the environment we were working in, it wasn't effective. This law wasn't effective. The approach to rounding up cats and euthanizing them was just not effective. And so we wanted to make sure that any resource we had was put into play in a way that could really, really increase our impact. So for us, here were the critical prerequisites for success when we got our allies around the table. We wanted to seat a group that had balanced expertise and perspectives. We knew that if we could have robust discussions where we were representing as many viewpoints as possible, where we were advocating for as many perspectives and animal stakeholders as possible, that we would have the best outcome. We focused a lot on respect and collaboration and alignment. And early on, we probably spent the first couple of months just clarifying what the rules of engagement would be for how we would speak to each other, how we would speak to outside groups, how we would speak to the press, how we would do the science, how we'd prioritize when we thought we would need to convene the group. And I think that investment was absolutely critical and really paid off. And then, as I mentioned, we started with the beliefs that we shared, because we knew that there were many we may not share, but that this could be a place that we would come back to. And one easy one is that we all agreed that cats should not live, it was better for cats to live indoors. And so, you know, once you identify one, then you can identify other areas of common ground, then you really have something to build on. And this foundational work powered the science. There's no doubt in my mind. So collaboration and trust, identifying common ground, following where the data leads. There were a lot of people early on who wanted to, who asked us, what are you going to do with this? What are your plans? And we kept saying, we don't know. We have to wait until the project is completed, and then we will make decisions about what we're going to do differently going forward. But we don't know what the data is going to tell us. And that was really hard for people because, as I mentioned, we had so many stakeholders, everybody really cared about the outcome. And we were very disciplined about staying in the moment with the data and not getting ahead of ourselves. We also knew that setting priorities was going to be important, not only for the project, but for the application of the science. And so we talked a lot about our priorities, and we would sometimes revisit them and reorganize them. Involving the community here was important. And we were lucky that we found many people who would serve as citizen scientists to participate in the parts of the program that Tyler and John are going to talk about a little bit later. And those citizen scientists were critical for us in collecting the data. And we were fortunate in that we had grant money for this project. We know a lot of communities care about this issue, and so we wanted to do a project that could ultimately be scalable and adaptable to any geography, any community. And you're going to hear more about the ways that this can be applicable, even if you're not fortunate enough to have the $1.5 million investment that we were given to do this. And so we had three main project goals: to develop valid methods for quantifying cat populations, to create an archetype for the collaboration of stakeholder groups who may not be aligned at the start, and to be generous with what we found and what we learned and what we developed, that we wanted to share this with as many groups as possible. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tyler Flocker with Flockhart Consulting, and he's going to talk a lot about the science behind the project.
Thank you. Don't forget your coffee. It's a different one.
All right. Let's see. It's okay. We actually do need to do. So we keep going. That's okay. You find, is it this one? Oh, I have to go on. And this one. Okay, hopefully this goes away. Okay, I think that's the best thing. Is it okay?
Yep.
All right.
That's great.
Arrow is here, so you just use these.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. All right. So thank you, Lisa, for setting that up. I'm going to talk a lot about the science, the data collection, the data analysis, and all sort of the science components underneath the umbrella of the DC cat count. Nope.
have to click on the screen. I don't know. There.
Which one did you push?
I just had to click on activate the screen.
Okay.
That's just,
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so we should be good to go here. So when we started talking about cats and about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, when I started thinking about cats, my background in wildlife ecology sort of allowed me to stand there and think, okay, how many cats are there? And when I asked people that I was sort of working with and talking with at the time, I said, how many cats are there? And they said, oh, I have no idea. There's probably about 20,000. And then I'd ask somebody else and they'd say, oh, there's probably about 100,000. And I talked to people in Toronto and they came up with an estimate by asking experts to figure out the feral cat issue in Toronto. And the estimates range from 25,000 to 500,000. And I said to myself, that's a really big range because, you know, at the lower end, you might not have a problem. And up at the other end, you're going to have cats in every rooftop. So how do you guys come up with that number? And they said, well, we really don't know. We just sort of guess. I thought, okay, so this is the role of a wildlife biologist, right? Is to count animals and to come up with valid ways of estimating population size and dynamics. And so when we started thinking about cats, I started putting them in these different sort of buckets, thinking about, okay, well, we're going to have some cats that are outdoors. We're going to have some cats that are indoors, and we're going to have some cats that are in a shelter system. And I know that there's cats that go between these different groups, right? We often think about shelters being sort of that conduit of animals being perhaps outside and unowned into owned families. So we know that there's arrows going back and forth here, and we know that sometimes cats are surrendered to shelters. Sometimes people can't keep their animals for whatever reason, and they take them to a shelter and they're rehomed. And sometimes people will actually let their animals go intentionally or bring them into their house from the back alley. And when I started talking about these ideas to people, they said, oh, this happens all the time. 3 of my 5 cats I found on the street. Okay, so in my mind, I started thinking there's got to be a lot of cats that are actually flowing between these different categories. And when I talked to some of my friends that were interested in wildlife ecology, they said, well, these are the cats that I'm really interested in. The outdoor cats that are killing birds, causing extinctions, all these sorts of dramatic things that are happening. And when I talked to people in my local shelter, they were really interested in the shelter cats and how do we get cats into homes. And me, I was sort of somewhere in the middle. I thought, well, I'm really interested in how outdoor cats might operate almost like wild animals, right? If they are truly feral animals that have to find their own food to survive, they're going to be acting in certain ways compared to my neighbor's fluffy cat that is outside lying on the front porch for 3 hours a day and doesn't move until it goes back inside. So thinking about these sorts of buckets, we started thinking about, well, how do you sample these different cats? How do you quantify these cats? And what are the dynamics of these different cats as they move between these different buckets? And most of these movements are through human interventions, right? So this is where the human component comes into this, is understanding the numbers of cats in each one of these buckets and how they move between them. So I'm going to talk today about outdoor cats and the sampling that we did in Washington, D.C., and a little bit about the sampling that we've done in Maui to quantify outdoor cats. And for the DC cat count, when we were talking about estimating free roaming cats, we decided to do 2 types of sampling. The first is we would use transect surveys using a distance sampling approach. So this is walking transects and counting cats as you go along and recording attributes about those cats. And the second was using camera traps. So these are stationary cameras that are set up and they photograph animals or anything that moves in front of them and records a photograph. And these are 2 really common ways of collecting data in wildlife biology. And we have really good methodologies to analyze those data and to quantify populations. Interestingly, very few people do this for cats. And I think that this is like one of these really nice interdisciplinary sciences where you have a real need and you have specialists in ecology that do this. This is what they do. And so I sort of got myself in the middle of this and I thought, okay, I can actually contribute to this challenge that people that are working with cats are facing and trying to answer this basic question. How many cats are there and where are they on the landscape? So of the 2 studies that we did, first I wanted to just mention the camera trapping sampling that we've done. And this was a paper that Mike Cove published last year. And it used 1,483 camera deployments over 3 years, and we had about 31,000 images of cats. So you get a lot of data from these camera traps. I mean, anybody that's worked with camera traps knows that it's not an issue of having data, it's actually how do you work with all that data? How do you process it? But the other issue that you have is when you set up all of these cameras all over the place, you need to capture photographs of cats, and you need to identify individual cats as well, because this is sort of a mark recapture type of analysis. But one of the challenges with mark recapture is that you need to be able to identify individuals. And for some things you can do that. They do it for tigers, they do it for whales, right? You can see individual attributes and you can say, oh, this is that individual or this is that individual. But with cats, we have some cats that look very unique, and then we have a bunch of black cats and a bunch of white cats. And so that runs into a problem because then you have sort of these two types of data, right? And one is more useful than the other for quantifying population sizes. And so one of the really nice things that Mike did is he was able to use a partially identifiable hierarchical model, which is a mouthful, to basically account for the fact that you can identify some individuals, but not all of them. And using this data, they came up with a really nice estimate of population size. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to compare that to some of the sampling that we did with Transect. So I'm going to talk about the Transect sampling and some of the attributes that we used. So this included 69 different transects that are depicted here across the district. And we observed 580 cats on those 69 transects. And the whole goal of it was to fit a series of fairly simple statistical models based on underlying spatial data, because the question becomes, how many cats are there? Where are they? What are the factors that predict the abundance and distribution of cats? And while this may seem like sort of a really simple type of question, it gets to the heart of how many cats are there and where are they, right? We're basically starting from scratch when we're doing this to do it in a systematic way. And some of the underlying spatial variables that we are interested in are distance to major roads, thinking that roads could act as both barriers and potentially hazards to outdoor cats. The distance to wooded areas, which again may work as an area of attraction for food sources, or it may act as areas of repelling if there's things like coyotes or predators in those areas. Distance to waterways as well. And then general land use categories. And we use 3 land use categories. Sort of the pink areas are the built up areas. The blue areas are sort of moderate development. And then the green areas are these natural areas that Lisa mentioned before. And we're also interested in factors like socioeconomic indicators as well, because there seem to be patterns, particularly when you look at shelter data with respect to intake and outcome of cats, as well as ownership patterns of those cats. So we expected that, that would transfer onto the landscape as well with respect to outdoor cats. All right, and then we're going to describe patterns of abundance across the district, and we're going to hopefully estimate a total number of free roaming cats. But I put at the bottom there detection, because when you are counting animals, there's a lot of assumptions that go into that. One of them is detection probability, right? That you can actually count cats that are present. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So one of the first things that we needed to look at when we started to build these models were sort of the simple relationships and whether they existed or not. And there's quite a bit of research that links socioeconomics, like household income, and the number of cats on the landscape. This has been found in many communities, but the pattern didn't seem to show up in the data that we had for the transects. It did show up with the camera trap data, but it wasn't quite as apparent in the transect data. And I suspect that it probably would show up if we had a larger sample size, but just given the data that we had, it didn't sort of pop up. And that was really surprising, because I sort of thought that that was almost a take-home guarantee that that was going to be the case. So in the rest of the models I'm going to show you, that attribute is actually not included. So using distance sampling, which includes walking a transect line and you count the distance off the transect line that you see animals, basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to fit this curve right here. And this curve is, given that an animal is present, in this case a cat, what's the probability that you will observe it, given that it's present? And the assumption is that you have 100% chance of seeing a cat that's right on the transect line. So you're going to see the cat if you're going to step up, which is a fairly safe assumption, I think. And then the idea is that as you get further away from where you're walking, you're less likely to see a cat that's actually there. And so our data suggests that you basically can't see cats beyond about 40 meters away from you, right? And this is one way that you can take sort of these point attributes of seeing cats and make it into a spatial process so you can actually calculate density. And here are just the bar graphs of the distance from the observer and the number of cats that we've seen. And as you can see, most of them are seen fairly close to us, right? Which generally makes sense. And this sort of relationship here is reflected in this attribute here. So what we wanted to do is compare these really simple models. Here's a list of models here and the different attributes that I mentioned before. And then this just uses AIC, which is a theoretical weighting attribute, to figure out which model holds the largest support given the data that you have. So anybody that's done model comparisons will look at this and say, oh boy. And basically what this says is that we have a lot of models here that actually equally explain the data. So it's not as though there's one take-home model that, thank you, that really stand out and describes the pattern and distribution of cats. So given that that's the case, and I mentioned this to John a few minutes ago, I think we need to increase sample sizes. And that may just be that there's so much variation in the data, or that we just aren't having the right spatial attributes to predict the outcomes of the number of cats. And when we look at sort of the distribution of these factors, you can see that there's quite a bit of overlap. Anything that's sort of below 0 has a negative relationship, anything above has a positive relationship. And things that overlap like this suggest that the relationship isn't really all that strong. When you take out the land use pattern, again, it doesn't look like the patterns are all that strong, but there are still positive and negative relationships here. So essentially what you can do is you can take those data and you can do a spatial prediction across your geographic area. And essentially that's what this is we have a relative density of cats across Washington, DC. The bright red areas are sort of the hot spots. That is the areas that are predicted to have the highest number of cats. But one thing to note is with respect to where the sampling was actually done. And you'll see that there's a really big hotspot down in this area here. And we didn't actually have any samples down in this location. So I think one of the things that I've taken back to the group is to say, I think we need to target some of the locations that we're sampling a little bit better. We tried to do a stratified design, which I think is great for initial studies, but it sort of has come down that these points down here in particular are probably really important to understanding cat distributions. And we might have to do a little bit more fine tuning and targeting sampling there. There are potentially some issues there in terms of safety of having people out in some of these areas. So that's something that we really need to consider as well. And this is sort of one of the realities of sampling in urban areas. And one of the nice things is that we have two independent data sets now where we can actually predict and look at the abundance and distribution of cats to see if these two methodologies suggest that the spatial attributes are predicting these relationships are the same. And if the densities in one area are similar to the densities in another using the data sets. Again, this is to increase our inference and be able to be more certain in drawing conclusions. All right, now I'm going to quickly jump to Maui. So Lisa mentioned that we wanted to make things replicable and scalable. And so we have been doing some sampling out on Maui. And Maui is very different than Washington, DC. And the most obvious is that it's an oceanic island. And oceanic islands are sort of like the big sort of elephant in the room when it comes to the impacts of cats on wildlife, right? We've heard about predation risk to birds and extinction events and things like that. And those generally happen on oceanic islands. And the question is, does that transfer to mainland populations such as in Washington, DC? But there's also other aspects that we need to think about. And this sort of gets into this, I guess, One Health or this integrated approach to thinking about cat management. And that is things like disease risk and toxoplasmosis for endangered Hawaiian monk seals. And this is a monk seal right here, an endangered species in Hawaii. And toxoplasmosis is transferred. Cats are an integral part of that disease dynamic, right? So when you have cats that are on the landscape and they're defecating, the toxo can actually end up in the water system. It can end up on the beaches, right? So you have this sort of interesting and perhaps unfortunate interaction between cats and the conservation of monk seals, which is a step away from the traditional idea of cats and birds. Okay, so the objective here was to provide island-wide estimates of the relative abundance of domestic cats. And when we started thinking about Maui, we started thinking about these urban areas that happen particularly along the coast. These are sort of the touristy areas and where most of the development and the action actually happens. And so perhaps not surprisingly, that's where most of the cats are. So we thought to ourselves, well, if we're going to be sampling in this area, it's quite different than areas, you know, up here on the volcanoes, right, which are usually high elevation, where you typically have the endemic bird species. And so we started thinking about this sort of as like a two-tiered approach, right? You have the sampling in the urban areas and then outside the urban areas. And how do you put that information together, recognizing that sampling in these more remote areas is quite expensive and quite difficult. And so we started thinking about sampling inside and outside, as well as these, what we are now calling sort of hotspots, these areas where you get these large numbers, abnormal high concentrations of cats. And you may be able to predict why the cats are there, but it may also be an artifact of historical circumstance, right? It may just be an area where people traditionally go and abandon animals because that's what people do sometimes, right? And there's particularly a place in Maui, and that's what the park is known for. And there are literally hundreds of cats there. So how do you predict these hotspots and where do they arise? So the sampling effort was quite similar to Washington, D.C. We had camera traps across the island. We did walking transects. And then we also did these point counts, or what I would call sort of hotspot or complete count analyses. And these were really focused in areas that were told to us by our collaborators. So hotels, golf courses, and harbors. And people had different explanations for why that could occur. And I think it'd be a really neat sort of study to sort of tease into those different hypotheses about why that may occur at those different spots. So quickly, just looking at a couple of the models of the transect surveys. Again, these are like really basic models, right? To sort of get a handle on what the patterns look like. And perhaps unsurprisingly, zoning, so we're talking about industrial, commercial, and residential areas, seem to be the best predictor on this system. And at least for the relative densities, the highest numbers are in residential areas and industrial areas, and then commercial areas, there seems to be far fewer cats. Now, when we look at the camera trap data, we're interested in occupancy because we want to know, as you get towards the edge of the urban areas, how does that curve of the probability of occupancy drop off? It's likely to be very high in urban areas, and then as you get to the edge or just outside of the urban areas, it should drop off. Whether it's slow drop or a dramatic drop, we're not entirely sure, but that sort of has interesting dynamics for the potential impacts that those cats may have on more wild areas outside of the cities. So these initial analyses are just looking at things like elevation, distance to the coast, and distance to urban areas. And the points that you see there are locations of cats that were observed on cameras. And these relationships are, I don't know, perhaps not totally satisfying from a statistician point of view, but there does seem to be relationships there in terms of distance to urban areas, and this is a negative relationship. So this is that drop off that we would expect. There seems to be a positive relationship with elevation. And again, I think that this is being driven by these points here that are higher up on the volcano. But really, when you look at all of the other samples that were taken, they're all really quite low, right? So I think that we need to increase the sampling that we're doing higher up on the slopes to get a more representative sample there. Because in all honesty, I think that we would expect a negative relationship there. As you go higher on the hill, you have a less probability of having cats. And then the last one was distance to the coast. And again, this is contrary to what I would expect. I would expect there to be more cats closer to the coast than further away. And that's both an attribute of the fact that there's urban areas there and the fact that there's more resources there. But this one I'm not entirely certain of. So just to sum up, generally residential areas contain more cats. I don't think that this is sort of groundbreaking science or anything like that. But having data and understanding those patterns and being able to use it to draw inference, I think is still really important. And it's still early days in terms of data analysis and understanding these patterns. The second is that there seems to be trends for more cats in low socioeconomic areas. Didn't find that in DC with the transect data, but we have found that in other places in Canada, with the camera data in DC, and the Maui data and some other data sets that we've worked with. That's a general pattern that seems to hold. There's a lot of variation in the data, and this is not surprising because we're talking about counting animals, and usually you can have clumps of animals that really throw things off, right? And when you're thinking about counting cats and dogs in particular, you can end up with these hotspot areas where all of a sudden you count 80 animals, right? And normally you're expecting, you know, singles, 3, 4, 7 animals. So that whole idea of like variation and these hotspots, I think is really, really interesting and sort of a really fairly novel avenue of research. And the last thing is detection probability is always the bane of trying to estimate animals from counts, because you have to make assumptions about what the factors are that influence your detection of those animals. And one of the really great things about cats, I guess, is that detection probability can get broken down into different categories. One is availability. So are animals actually outside to be sampled? If they are an indoor-outdoor cat, they might not actually be outside when you walk your transect. The second is accessibility. Are they even in the area where you're sampling, or are they in the back alley where you can't actually observe them? And then the third one is detection. How good are you at actually observing animals, given that it's there? So these are sort of different levels of detection probability that aren't really as prevalent in other organisms, but they really are in cats, and particularly indoor-outdoor cats, because the number of indoor-outdoor cats probably far exceeds the free-roaming cats that are outside 24 hours a day. And I think the last thing is just integrating different data sets, not only to look at these detection probabilities, but also to think about how cats might move between these different buckets, between being an indoor cat, an indoor-outdoor cat, or an outdoor cat. And how do you separate those different groups of cats to know the cats that you're quantifying? And with respect to the management that you're interested in, how do you target the cats that really you think are influencing your system? So I think that from a statistical standpoint, it's a really interesting system to work on. And we need more brains in this area to work on. So if you have brains and you like statistics, come and talk to me. Thanks.
Bunch of things. How about here? We're gonna do
Right.
arrow. Yeah, just this
Okay.
arrow, right?
Very good.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name's John Boone. I am a biologist with the Great Basin Bird Observatory based in Reno, Nevada. So the bulk of my work is in conservation, and specifically conservation science for birds. I also have worked as a consultant for a number of years for Humane Society of the United States and for other organizations as well, primarily on the kinds of things that Tyler's just been talking about. So that has given me an interesting sort of, seat at the edge of a precipice between two traditionally, non-communicative camps or adversarial camps, but I think we can see some of those things coming together more and more. And along that line, before I get into the detailed topics of my talk, I want to step back a little bit, think about the overall theme of these presentations that you're listening to this morning, which is integrated management for free-roaming cats. Define that a little bit. And I think what we mean by that is mobilizing or utilizing all of the resources, all of the skill sets that we can assemble toward achieving some sort of well-quantified goal or goals, shared goals, and doing that with an acceptable level of efficiency and effectiveness. And typically with cats in urban areas, that's going to represent some sort of collaboration, right? As Lisa talked about earlier. Now, integrated management can have many, many parts. They don't always have to be the same parts depending on the application, but I've shown some of them up here today, along with a little bit of an indication about where the relevant resources and expertise are most likely to come from. So in the far left-hand column, we've got a couple of items under the banner that's AW. By that, I just mean animal welfare organizations, animal control organizations, that sort of thing. And as is probably apparent to you, the primary management actions for free roaming outdoor cats are typically in urban areas going to come from that wheelhouse. That's where the expertise, the precedents, the infrastructure, all of those things exist. Now we're primarily talking about here in terms of primary management approaches or actions, some sort of sterilization, TNR sort of thing, because that's what's going to be at least potentially universally acceptable among a collaborative group. There's a great deal of resistance to using lethal means of cat control as a first, at least as a first approach in urban areas in particular. I've also listed synergistic management actions, and these can be terribly important for integrated management. These are things, some of Lisa talked about some of these things earlier today, the adoption programs, programs to educate cat owners to better care for their cats, keep them indoors if they're in sensitive areas, get them spayed or neutered at an appropriate time in their life, and support programs to give owners the resources they need, the wherewithal to keep more cats in homes and not simply turn them loose to roam when they move. So those are some of the components of integrated management that are going to come primarily from animal welfare. The second column in this slide, TC, that's the technical collaborator. That's what that stands for. And that item is listed as advanced design, mapping, analysis, and assessment. That includes a whole bunch of things, but they all involve the kinds of training and technical skills that Tyler gave you an introduction to earlier. So those are going to typically come from that part of a collaboration. But there are lots of elements that really work the best or are most feasible or are most applicable and helpful if they are part of a collaborative effort. And that's the third column to the right, where animal welfare and technical collaborator are sitting next to each other. And those involve items like planning, something that's been underperformed, I think, in some cat management programs before, creating a management plan over time, identifying targets and that sort of thing. The actual data collection, not the data analysis particularly, but the actual collection of data, the transect counts, the placing of cameras, the processing of camera pictures, that is labor intensive, and typically it can be done most efficiently by utilizing the resources, the skills, the available time of both of these types of partners together. And then finally, there's an item there for more basic mapping, analysis, and assessment. The idea here is that it can be inefficient in terms of effective integrated management to essentially have no capacity to do anything with your data unless you're able to bring in a consultant who charges $100 an hour or whatever they charge. It's very much more practical to ensure that all of the partners, or at least several of the partners in a collaboration, have the ability to do at least some basic things with the data that they help to collect to gain insight and guidance for their future actions. So those are the parts of integrated management. As you might well expect, there have been and there remain many barriers to actually adopting a model like this. One of those barriers, one that I won't talk about explicitly except to mention it, is simply a willingness to cooperate. And that's what Lisa talked about in her initial talk. There is just an aversion in many quarters to working with people from the other side of the camp based on unfamiliarity, based on the perception that goals don't overlap, or based on just the history of animosity that have occurred among those parties. I don't have any solutions for you in my talk, but when we talk about precedent, which is my third bullet point down there, that's one of the key factors in making collaboration more feasible and less scary to groups. Other barriers involve technical skills. I just talked about how keeping the technical skills all entirely compartmentalized within the sort of the expert part of the collaboration is not necessarily productive, or it doesn't foster a sense of inclusivity. But these technical skills, even the basic ones, can be scary to many people who work in the animal welfare field and have not ever had the appropriate training or exposure to those sorts of things. So that's a barrier. And then the last barrier that I'll mention here is just the perception that it's even feasible and valuable to do the kind of integrated approach that we're talking about here. Part of that comes from just institutional inertia. We do what we are familiar with and what we're comfortable with. Part of it is the lack of precedence of this sort of thing actually happening with cats in a large urban area over time and having success. So I'll talk a little bit for the remainder of my talk about our approaches to dealing with the second and the third type of barrier that I've mentioned here. And the solutions that we have focused on thus far in this regard are to create and share tools and resources that help practitioners, organizations to overcome some of these barriers, and to try to curate or foster certain kinds of implementations of integrated management that can stand as examples of what is possible. So I'll talk about these in a little more detail now. Tools and resources, getting back to the DC Cat Count project. One of the goals of that project was to generate what we ended up calling a toolkit. Lisa alluded to this. This is basically a freely available summary of basically all of our findings and our advice that we could offer to people who wanted to do an implementation. And I should take a moment to clarify that what we did in the DC Cat Count was focused very much on refining methods for counting cats, but that's only part of integrated management, right? An actual management project would use cat counting in order to achieve some particular goal, to reduce the number of cats on the landscape. And the toolkit sort of is a little bit of a bridge between these two worlds, just between the technical world of cat counting and the applied world of doing something about cats on the landscape in an integrated way. Okay, so this toolkit, it's available at the URL that's mentioned at the top of that page. You can also just search for DC Cat Count Toolkit and it will come right up. It's divided into a number of sections, major sections, 3 major sections, and a bunch of smaller sections that you see summarized here. Some of the sections deal with the different ways to obtain data for cat counting, which you see listed on the left. Tyler mentioned 2 of them, at least, which are transect counts and camera surveys. And we also have some stuff in there about working with shelter data. The second major heading, project design and management, deals with things like goal setting, an introduction to how populations work, which is new news for some of the people in these collaborations who are used to focusing on cats on an animal by animal basis, appropriate metrics to use when you're counting cats, and things along those lines. And then finally, we have some of the more advanced sections about working with data, how to design a sampling plan, how to do some basic sorts of analysis. So that's all there. That's one way of trying to reduce the novelty of this whole cat counting part of the equation, and making it more accessible to more users. And I'd like to dive down a little bit deeper into just a part of that. Let me see if that's actually sort of readable up on the screen for you guys. In the goal setting section, we have a diagram like this. And when when Tyler and I and others started thinking about the DC Cat Count and Danielle and applications, one of the real needs that we identified early on was that lots of people went out and did something with the goal of helping or, making 15 cats sterilized. This is not the kind of more detailed goal setting that really makes sense in the context of integrated management. We need something that's a little more systematic, a little bit more deeply thought out, and a little bit more directed toward bigger goals, like the number of cats on the landscape. So you can see this sort of schematic that we've got here. for goal setting, which starts with thinking about your big goal, reducing the number of cats on the landscape in this case, but not stopping there, getting down to the details like defining the population we want to work with. I'm going to go a little bit longer if that's okay, since we is or
Yeah, so we should have like probably braked for you.
I see, because of the breaks.
So
I can take a
because-
break and then pick up a little bit.
Yeah,
afterwards.
you can go ahead and finish, and then we'll take a break and then we'll continue with yours, since there was a gap in the schedule, so it'll throw other people off.
Is that okay? Okay.
I think.
Okay, I'll go for 10 if that's okay. Okay. So we define the population, we have to define the time frame, and we have to then quantify the outcome, not just qualitatively describe it to define our applied goal. And then from that point, we have to think about how we're going to get there with procedural goals, which you see in the middle top, and how we're going to support that with cat counting. And then finally, that goes into this whole adaptive management loop that many of you have heard of, where we don't assume that our first plan will actually work, but that we need to let the data tell us what's working and what's not working and make refinements to our approach accordingly. Other things that are in the cat count toolbox are concepts that are helpful to bring everybody onto the same sort of conceptual page about their goals. As I described earlier, many animal welfare organizations typically define their goals in terms of just sterilizing a certain number of cats, but without necessarily appreciating the progression of these different metrics and the causality of them. So a high sterilization percentage reduces the number of kittens, will eventually reduce the population, we hope, and then change the shelter intake and on down the line. I would like to mention briefly here that Tyler has also been working on an adjunct to this DC Cat Count Toolkit, or the next step of it, let's say, that is called Companion Animal Tools. You see one example of a screenshot here. This is meant to provide people doing cat management with some capacity to visualize and analyze their data at a basic level that has been missing heretofore. It gives them more of an investment in it. It lets them learn from it a little bit more easily. So in the coming months and years, I think this will be an important contribution to this toolbox. Sort of rounding out the tour of tools and resources that are becoming available and making integrated cat management more and more possible. There are a street app that's been developed, Talia, specifically for dog and cat counting projects. So it's a little bit easier entryway than some of the more general purpose tools for electronic data recording and collection. This helps make it more accessible to a lot of people. You all know, I'm sure, or many of you know anyway, about the big suite of GIS-based products that have become available in recent years or decade or so to collect data electronically, create dashboards and that sort of thing so that people can interact with their data a little bit more readily. So many tools and resources have become available in recent years that should help to make integrated cat management and a collaboration more feasible. Curated implementations. We need some examples of how this will work for people to look at and use for inspiration. One example that I really like is being piloted by the ASPCA in some of their project areas. It basically just is a template for entering cat counting data into a Excel template, which you see here. The colored columns represent cat counts done over time. And these are just basic data about the number or percentage of cats that are ear tipped, which is an indication that they've been sterilized, versus not ear tipped. And you can see that if you work down the spreadsheet, it gives lots of good feedback on whether groups are hitting their targeted sterilization rates, which need to be high in order to have an impact, and whether they're having an impact on the density of cats, whether that seems to be steady or going down, which is the goal. Another curated implementation that we will be pushing very hard on is a follow-up on the Maui work that Tyler just described. Specifically, what we hope, and this is an example of some of the data from transects that came from Maui, showing where cats are either ear-tipped, which I believe is the green dots or not ear tip, which is the red dots, and you see already some sort of interesting localized clusters there. The idea is to use this with the stakeholders on Maui to help plan a meaningful and effective program for cat management on the island that spans a number of years. And all of these curated implementations, and there's many that I'm not talking about today in the interest of time, will be done under this adaptive management framework, where data that are collected don't just go into a folder, but they get used to try to understand if we have a good plan and if we have enough resources to make that plan work. One thing I want to mention very briefly at the end, it's something we haven't worked on much yet, but I think it's going to be critical for making integrated management more meaningful and effective, is appropriate targeting. We all know if we come from a biological background, that there are many tools and analytical approaches to identifying priority habitat or critical habitat for a given species, or for suites of species, for communities, for ecosystems. That's sort of bread and butter stuff. We also know, and Tyler talked about this a little bit, that there are techniques, species distribution models, and things that are similar to them for depicting, estimating, predicting, quantifying how a given animal is distributed over space and time. Put those things together, you identify priority areas for focused cat management, where the impact is of concern and where the density of cats is high enough for that impact to be especially concerning. The degree to which this has not been done in the past is striking. We argue about it like it's a monolithic sort of problem that we have out there in the landscape, when in fact, the reality is very different from space to space. And we all need to do a better job of identifying where good cat management really, really matters the most and focusing efforts there. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about in terms of progress and prospects. I think we've made good progress. I think the prospects are better and better as time goes by, but it's still a work in progress. And with that,
All right, so I think in interest of keeping with the schedule, so that, because you're at 9:20, I believe. So let's keep with that. We'll take a break now, a bathroom break, and then we'll resume at 9:20. So we'll stay on that, and then there's a question session after yours, 9:40. So get your questions ready. You can tell jokes. Yeah.
Cat and a parrot.
When you put a cat
Do you get a
and a parrot together.
what do you get?
A carrot.
A carrot.
Ah.
Okay, so no chip.
Okay, I like it.
My 7-year-old's gonna love that.
Cool. Yeah, sorry about all this stuff. I was not expecting to be moderator. They did not tell me that. But yes. So you're gonna use this arrow. Okay.
Okay, I already told my joke, so that's my icebreaker. So I am Danielle Bays. I am the senior analyst for cat protection and policy at the Humane Society of the United States. Yes, I am the cat person. I guess it was yesterday, Monday, sitting upstairs, and there were some folks sitting near me, and I could hear them talking. And they're like, "Yeah, the cat people are here," and I was like, "Wait, that would be me. Or you have a concern?" I will out myself. But I actually started my career in animal advocacy, is how I consider what I do. Focus on wildlife protection, and like a lot of people who work on free roaming cats, I got into it because I moved into a house where there were a lot of cats outdoors. I like to say that my next door neighbor had been feeding the cats and she moved in 1956. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's the story I like to tell. And now none of those cats are there. We have one cat on the block left. So I also, you start on the cats, and then next thing you know, you're working with Lisa LaFontaine, running a community cat program in the district. And it was a really educational experience in trying to figure out how to do the best program we could. We were really, really lucky in having a lot of excellent funding. And our funding was for this number of surgeries for the community cat. So our goal, of course, to satisfy our funders is to do that. But how do we know whether a program was really making a difference? We did a lot of targeting. John mentioned that. We were targeting particular areas that our shelter data told us were hotspots. And maybe that explains why some of the socioeconomic areas in DC had fewer cats. I don't know, because we didn't have the tools then to be able to know what our populations were and how they were changing outside. We're using our indirect metrics of cats coming to the shelters, knowing if I spent a lot of time in an area, there were still more cats there. We somehow weren't being effective. So I was really interested in trying to figure out how we could be more effective and how we could know whether what we were doing specifically was making a difference. And so I took this interest with me when I moved over to work for the Humane Society of the United States, and look at this kind of nationally, and was really excited to be able to bring that kind of full circle and work on the DC cat count here in Washington, DC. But I just want to talk a little bit about some animal welfare organizations. So the Humane Society of the United States, if you're not familiar with it, is a national animal advocacy organization. We are not just about dogs and cats. We do not run shelters. We actually do a lot of wildlife work. I see a number of my colleagues here in the back. I don't know, maybe we do more work on wildlife protection than we do on dogs and cats. I see there may be some nodding. We work on a lot of issues. And there are a lot of different types of animal welfare organizations. So when we talk about getting animal welfare organizations involved, there are a lot of different ones. And I've been struggling with cats since, before there were color photos. There are the larger national organizations like the HSUS and the ASPCA, which you heard earlier about some of their work on cat counting. You also probably are familiar with them from that ad on television with Sarah McLachlan. Yeah, they have all the money. There are animal shelters, animal control agencies. Animal shelters also take different forms. Some are government organizations, so they're run by the government. Their mandates are what the government tells them they are. Some are nonprofits that have their own missions. And some are like the Humane Rescue Alliance in here in DC, which is a nonprofit, but also has the contract with the city to do animal services. Same with animal control agencies. They may be attached to the shelter. They may be under the police department. They kind of run the gamut of a lot of different things. We also have rescue organizations, cat-focused nonprofits, sometimes they're coalitions. Not everyone is exactly on the same page with a lot of stuff. We also have high volume spay-neuter clinics, which I'm going to mention here because it's a really important partner when we're talking about data collection. So we have all sorts of different organizations, and I'm going to talk broadly about animal welfare organizations. So I just want you to know, they're kind of like where all you work. Some of you work for nonprofits. Sometimes it's the city or the state government. Government-run organizations may have a different level of red tape than nonprofits do. So we can work together, maybe not be BFFs, but we could aspire to that. We heard earlier about our common goals, and that was a big thing with our the DC cat count, is we knew that we're common goals. And it wasn't just that we want to reduce the number of cats outside, it's that we want to know how to measure that. We want to know how to know how effective we can be doing different strategies. There was a study in 2022 that was in the UK, was comparing conservation and animal welfare professionals' perspectives on domestic cat management. And they did find that there was a lot of common in there. Particularly that cat owners who were working as conservation professionals were very cognizant of the cat welfare considerations, and animal welfare professionals were also very concerned about wildlife, particularly wild animal welfare. And so this kind of thing highlights the opportunities we have for constructive dialogue, greater collaboration, especially amongst the ecologists and other data scientists in animal welfare organizations. If we have better tools, we have the right tools, we can really make an impact, whatever kind of integration we're going to do with our cat programs, whatever they may be. They're all going to look a little different. One example, and I was just talking here with Dana about Portland. If any of you were at I think the last in-person conference, which was in Portland, we heard from the folks that do the Cat Safe at Home program. It is a collaboration with Portland Audubon, the Feral Cat Coalition of Oregon, yes, the Feral Cat Organization, and the local shelters there. They have this great website where it is really focused on reaching the public in a very supportive way. But their vision is the metropolitan region where cats are safe at home, resulting in safer and healthier environment for both cats and wildlife. They have a whole set of agreed upon principles that note that it's the successful reduction of the free roaming cat population that requires a collaboration and an array of strategies employed on multiple scales. It's not just one thing. They also launched a cat count on the Hayden Island community, which is just again, the northern part of Portland. They do annual cat counts there, and the volunteers that do that are volunteers with Portland Audubon. They're volunteers with the Feral Cat Coalition, and they're residents of that area, the people who live there. I got a chance to join them once, and I was walking around with the residents, and they were really excited about having these tools and these resources come to their community. What this group might be best known for is their Catio tour. I'm a big fan of Catios, but it was a great opportunity to have the public come in and learn about cats and wildlife in a very friendly way, a way that gives them solutions. I think they have over 1,000 people sign up for their Catio tour every year. In the pandemic, when they couldn't do it in person, they went online, which made it global. And there were even thousands more people that joined. This is really interesting. And we're seeing these kind of events spring up. It's a really great opportunity to work in collaboration in a way on things that we can really agree on. But one of the real keys where they're talking about the array of strategies. And I want to look at like integrated cat management from the perspective of a community, of a community animal welfare organization. Community outreach and engagement is key. I'm always going to put that at the top of anything. Is really, we talk about free roaming cats a lot in this context, but there's also the term that's often used as like community cats. And we really use that term because it's about the community and getting the community engaged in the issue and making, figuring out best solutions and implementing them. It's going to include spaying and neuter, including trap, neuter, return. I know a lot of folks can be hesitant about that. But one of the things I think is really key on that is that we have a lot of trap, neuter, return efforts that have gone on around the country without adequate data collection to show how well they're working or how well they're not. Can they be done better? Can they be more effective? We now are developing these tools to be able to do that. And like, what you heard earlier, the goal of the DC cat count wasn't necessarily to show that anything was working in DC or not. It was to develop the tools that any organization, any community could use to show what they are particularly doing, how well that may be working or not. We're going to have rehoming services and support for cat owners. And another thing that having these kind of tools to figure out data, figure out cat populations and the dynamics, how they're moving, can show where there might be areas that we need more intervention. And that may be services for cat owners. If we're finding a lot of stray cats in a particular area, are there people that need services there? Is there some way that we could do more outreach to that community, provide more spay neuter services for owners? Do they need support for like pet food? Are there economic reasons that their cats are ending up abandoned outside? What are these things that we can include? But consideration of wildlife and habitat is another key factor. And some communities may include this in their program, but they may not talk about it. And that's another thing we encourage you to really be more integrative with that and making it a higher element of your program. And then, of course, the population monitoring and adaptive management that we've heard about in the earlier presentations. But I would say this is really all about building relationships. my work, I'm not a scientist. That's why I love working with John and Tyler and other folks who can handle all of that. I work on policy and programmatic work, so we're building relationships with the public. When we're doing community work, we have to build their trust. We're building relationships with the other stakeholders, like folks in this room. We're building relationships with the government officials who we want to get involved and maybe fund this. We call this lobbying. We have, here we are, we're in downtown DC, we're K Streets, head of lobbying. A lot of people, a lot of organizations, they hire lobbyists. Why do they hire lobbyists? Because they're hiring those relationships. We don't need to hire lobbyists for ourselves. We can lobby amongst each other, but we need to build these relationships. And they're going to be built on respect, trust, understanding, and that means listening and acknowledging everyone's lived experiences, integrity, and most of all, showing up, being present. This is not just having one discussion with someone and expecting that you're going to have this great program. Lisa mentioned how many meetings we had, and we were already pretty much on the same page, but to have these conversations and make sure that we were clear on what the goals were. So in thinking about kind of building these relationships, I recently came across this spectrum of public participation, and I think it's a really cool chart. It was developed by the International Association for Public Participation. I guess they don't really have a lot of different synonyms for what they do. But it's kind of a spectrum of different ways that you can engage, just like informing. And that happens a lot where we just tell people things and expect them to change what they do. It doesn't always work, does it? It doesn't always work. I don't know if you can hear me. So I would suggest we need to kind of move towards the right here, involve and collaborate. The collaboration is what we did with the DC Cat Count. It was really a lot of engagement, but also when we're talking with stakeholders, we're building relationships with people in the community, cat groups, ecologists working together, we need to kind of really have more involvement and collaboration, because that's what's going to have the long lasting change we need to move this project along. So why should we collaborate with animal welfare organizations? So you're like, yeah, I could do all this, talk to the people. Because there are a lot of issues. Ooh, I got 5 minutes. I'm going to talk really fast. So animal welfare organizations have people, professional staff, animal control officers, humane officers that are already engaging with the public. Here we have wonderful Officer Ann, who's talking to this resident, who's so grateful because she's helping her out with some resources for the cats that she cares for outdoors. So there's a presence in the community. They already are talking to people. They're long-term in the in the community, their presence, they're connected. There may be opportunities to engage people with pet food pantries or spay neuter or vaccine clinics. There was a survey of animal shelters in 2018 that showed that 28% had staff that were dedicated to free roaming cat management. This is really showing a shift that we've had from a lot of the kind of community cat work, free roaming cat work being done just by individuals or kind of ad hoc groups, to showing that there's more of a professional approach to it in animal sheltering world, looking at things in a broader, even more of a One Health perspective. And they found that there were 53% that provided some sort of free roaming cat services, some sort of neuter, vaccinate, return service. So it's really kind of showing that shift. But with all this, they have a great local knowledge of the cat populations and the community attitude. So, we can do a lot of these surveys, the transects, the cameras, to see where the cats are. But looking at that in comparison to the local knowledge that people have, it may make a lot of sense to them. Sure, this is what we found. And that's also a good way to build that trust, to show that, what they know in their own mind is what we're finding that could be true. It may not be, because their perspective may not be as broad. Other opportunities that, animal welfare organizations have the potential to collect large amounts of data. There's so much data Shelter data, animals that are coming in the shelter, where they're going, where, you know, the stray animals are coming in, where they're adopted out to, how they're shifting. Like, think back to Tyler's integrated diagram there, how they're moving around. Animal control, they're getting calls from people, complaints about cats. Not necessarily, the way that data is collected now is not necessarily as specific as we want, but there are some folks that are working on kind of improving that. Spay neuter clinic data, thinking about cats that are pregnant or lactating. How could we use that data better? TNR programs, there are a lot of information that is collected there. You know, that's where they really know where a lot of those locations are, even if we're not utilizing that data as we could. And other record keeping with the caretakers. So there's a lot of opportunities that we have data, we maybe not really have good analysis of it right now. So in the future, we're looking at like expanding the implementation of cat counting beyond the DC and Maui projects that you heard about, building more collaborations, mentoring animal welfare organizations on the design, implementation, analysis of these methodologies, and kind of supporting these improvements in data collection. Again, I put the website here for the DC Cat Count Toolkit because I know you might have missed it earlier, and that's where it is. So I want to end with my obligatory photo of a cat. You may have noticed that many of my photos before were actually of people because this is really about people. But now that I'm going to talk about people again, I'm going to show my cat here, Morrissey, you note his ear tip and his catio, and have a call to action that we need more scientists, orcologists, data science, other folks who are interested in kind of this collaborative approach, to willing to work with the animal welfare organizations that are in our community to help us figure out how to be more impactful, to do things better. And if you're interested in that, you can contact me, you can contact any of my colleagues here, Tyler, John, Lisa, and we can get you engaged in that. So thank you very much. Did I get under my and I'm also happy to talk about patios.
So now we have a chunk of time for questions, Q&A, discussion. Said facilitate discussion, I think, okay.
We can facilitate ourselves.
Yeah.
I'll just leave my cute picture of my cat up here and I'm gonna make these folks stand up here.
See, as I mean, first.
Yes, I heard in a presentation earlier about the importance of buffering natural areas. And wondering, I didn't see that in your list of options, but in terms of maintaining the feral cat colonies. It seems like for wildlife protection, it would be great to buffer the natural areas that are important for birds and the wildlife.
I would say that was under wildlife consideration. I could talk for 5 hours about this, so.
You're right, and I think that falls under the thing that I very broadly mentioned about targeting, identifying where, you know, the priority areas on the landscape, and certainly for a natural area, its priority zone could and probably should in many cases include a buffer of some height. So I think it falls under that conception. As I mentioned, we as a group haven't gotten way far down the road with generating advice or guidelines for that kind of thing, but I think it's a task that needs to be done, and that's one of the parts of it for sure.
And are there resources? I've noticed in DC that's not the case. We have TNR colonies right outside natural areas sometimes. And what is the process for working to get those potentially moved?
One of the things that we looked at in the cat count was how many cats were actually in the national areas. And we did not see anywhere near as many as we expected. For us, we're bringing the cats back to the area where they were found. So we're bringing them back to the communities where they were being cared for, or the community cat caregiver who's managing them. We're not releasing them willy-nilly, and we're finding that these colonies are contracting over time.
Okay, that doesn't quite answer my questions. I work in a natural area in DC and I've seen cats in there. And if we were to take it to Humane Society to get fixed, it would be returned right back to that natural area where we have ground nesting birds and other sensitive wildlife. So I'm asking, can we get those moved, not returned to the area they were found, but returned to a less sensitive location?
I think for areas like that, that's one thing to look at. But the other thing we need to look at is why are those cats there in the first place? And instead of just move, I'm not saying not move them, I'm saying instead of just moving that, look at what other interventions that can be done there as well. Are they people's cats that they're being let outside? Are there increased abandonment there? Are there other services that would need to be there? So I think to look at it as like what packages of services need to be done in that area. So I would suggest, maybe afterwards we can talk about the specific area and maybe how we can all work together to figure out a plan for that specific area.
Yeah, and I would add that the DC cat count results did show both with transects and with cameras, encouraging differential between the cats that were in places where people lived and the natural areas of the district. So I get your point. I think those decisions, as Danielle said, are part of a collaborative planning process that's informed by information. So if that's a concern, I would encourage that sort of discussion to happen in DC. And I see.
Yeah, I'm on the other end of the spectrum with my good friend here, in that I argue that the removal of those feral cat colonies from natural areas might not have a positive effect on bird populations. You might actually have hungrier cats living there eating more birds. So I just think there needs to be more research done on that.
And I personally think that's a complicated question, what the impact is of cats versus not cats, and it's not a generic answer necessarily. But you're right, that's an entirely different topic and one that needs more work. You want to call out I guess.
Texas.
Okay, so,
Oh, I'm sorry. Texas is so big.
so we're social. We all have egos. God, we have some freaking egos. On issues like this, there's that lovely spectrum. And you have the extremes that tend to be more vocal. Those are the loud ones. And I'm just kind of curious how much energy we should invest in collaborations among the extremes. And we get such confirmation bias that once we get in our little tribes and our bubbles, that we start just agreeing with everybody that's in our tribes and bubbles. And sometimes these can be more polarizing. So I'm kind of asking the broad question in how do we collaborate? How do we collaborate without wasting energy on those extremes?
I'm sure all of us have, I'll pass this around in a second, but in the guidance, the DC Cat Count Toolkit guidance about collaborating, one of the things that specifically mentioned is that the idea of collaboration is great. To just randomly put together a group of entities that in theory represent all of the parts of the spectrum you talked about is probably doomed to failure. The collaboration needs to be built thoughtfully with people participating who have the mindset that allows them to be willing to collaborate and to think about things that are maybe outside their wheelhouse.
Identify that. How do you identify?
That's I don't think there's a bullet point list, but it requires discernment for sure.
I have two pieces of advice
Please.
that's worked for me. One is invest in the people that you don't normally agree with, right? If you sort of swing to one side or the other side, do something to engage with people on that other side and like actually jump in a little bit, right? Leave whatever you have at the door and just sort of jump in a little bit. And then the second piece of advice I have is when you find that person or those two people or those three people, grab them and hold on to them. Because like it's hard to find, but they're there, right? And I think you have to do the first step where you have to like invest, get to know people. And just sort of, I don't know, like have some type of connection with people. And then be willing to sort of say, I'm willing to leave all these things that I hold really dear to me on the side. Just to get to know this person a little bit, right? And if they're willing to do the same thing, and who knows if they will or not, right? Then hold on to them. And hopefully they're willing to do the same thing, right? Because like it's brutal.
Yeah.
We spend so much time yelling and fighting with each other that like it's a waste of time and energy, right?
Yeah.
So I would just say if you can find that person, just like hang on to them because it'll work. And I think we were really fortunate in sort of finding the right people and then spending months talking on the phone, right? I had many heated conversations with people. And it was just that they needed to be heard and I needed to be heard, and that was it, right? But we sort of got over those humps and identified these common goals that we're trying to achieve. And a lot of the common goals are the same, right? Sure. The means to get there are probably very different, but the goal itself is usually there. So that, I don't know if that helps or not, but
Thank you.
Yeah, the last thing I would add to that is that my image was of a concentric circle when we started this project. And that we seated people very intentionally who we knew could have these kind of conversations. And we laid the groundwork. And rather than starting on the extremes, we would rely on the stakeholders who were diverse at the table to have the conversation with their extreme. And so to build that concentric circle out over time. Yeah, so we didn't start in the most dramatic place. We started with a solid core and worked in.
and rely on those people to have those conversations. right?
Exactly.
It's all about building the relationships. Texas number 2.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to, follow up on the woman that talked earlier about, the problem of the trap and release cats in the national park area. In my area, there is a lot of people that are not pursuing the trap and release program because they bring the cats right back to the place and they don't want them there. They don't want the feral cats anywhere near their place. So some people are taking other methods to get rid of the cats. And I know that's probably not what y'all want, but there's got to be something done about the trap and release program if it's going to continue to exist. Find a way to put those cats somewhere else where people don't want them. It's a real problem.
I think one of the things to think about is that when you're doing trap, I say trap, neuter, return, because when we do it, the idea is that you would be returning the cats where they are, is the cats are already there. So if you're not doing trap, neuter, return, what is the other interventions that you're doing in that area? So I think you need to have that as part of the conversation. Especially when you're talking, it's community outreach. Is it one person that doesn't like the cats? Is it everyone? Is it one person who's feeding them but has bad practices? That you need to have, outreach to. Like, what is that situation to know what is done? But the idea that if we're not going to do this intervention, that something else is going to happen is what we have to think about. If we do nothing, are the cats going to go away? So what is that intervention? And this is where I struggle in my communication often with the folks that are more heavily on the wildlife side, is that if you're not doing the TNR, what are you doing to reduce the population of cats there? What is that intervention? Because I think there's this idea that, well, you've trapped the cat, and the question then is whether you bring the cat back or not. But that's not really where that discussion happens. It happens usually before the cat is trapped in the first place. If I can't bring that cat back, well, what am I going to do with the cat? What are my options? And as it's a lot of this work is done not necessarily by an organization, but by maybe individuals. So if that individual person can't bring that cat back, what are they going to bring it to their house? Is that an option? So like kind of, and this is where like thinking about this collaboratively and looking at how we can approach this and having that data and that information, having that community engagement and understanding what is needed there. What do the people want? Do the people not want the cats there? Okay, well, what are our other options that we need? Who are the other partners that can be brought into this to figure out what those solutions are? It's not easy. It's complex. It's hard. These are hard decisions for everyone. I don't know if that helps.
Not really.
So,
I understand you saying and other people saying that those cats should be gone if somebody traps them and want them gone now, but the reality that Daniel's describing is that most people who go do the effort to trap the cats won't do it under the premise that they just have to do some unknown thing with the cat other than bring it back. So you're saying people are taking matters into their own hands. They probably have. From an integrated cat management perspective, the solution is to recognize all of these competing concerns and to prioritize what to do where. So if there's a particular colony that data or just simple existing knowledge say is a real threat to something, my guess is that in a lot of places under a collaborative framework, your animal welfare organization might be willing to say, okay, we'll figure out someplace else to put these cats. But we don't have the capability to do that generically and to do it for everybody who just like them gone, right? So this is where recognizing the difference between some progress versus your idealized conception about how things could be becomes critical, right? And then we could pick out those one or two spots that we really want to go the extra mile on because there's a real demonstrated threat. The other places, people have to be more patient or do something else. So it's all part of this discussion. You can call it even negotiation if you want, but the prioritization, that's why it really is critical, because if you're a practical minded person and recognize that you can't snap your fingers and have the perfect thing occur, you have to make some choices and proceed according to those. I think that's feasible. To just refuse to participate in a discussion with people who do TNR because they can't move every cat they catch some mythical other place is not a constructive way to go about it. I don't think that this person has been had their hand up.
Texas 3.
So in San Antonio, we did look at the cat population 1 year. We had an intern and they essentially did some research or looked at already existing research, found that your domestic cats can travel up to 1 mile and feral cats up to 5 miles, typically from a particular cat colony. And so we were trying to look for solutions. And one of the things, and you said you haven't gotten to that stage yet, and kind of like what she was saying, we don't want to necessarily have them at least in or even in close proximity to our natural areas within our community, within a given city potentially, where a lot of wildlife definitely are attracted to going to, because that's their only available resources in some cases. So relocation of that existing cat colony would be something that we hoped might be an option. But we haven't gotten to that stage yet, talking to our local animal welfare groups yet. But you haven't mentioned, I guess, humane euthanization, and I'm just curious, is that, and maybe I'm not up to speed on it. I mean, I know in San Antonio, our Humane Society is no longer, well, it's primarily not the situation where it's a no-kill city now, supposedly. But that reverts back to a person who wants to pick up a stray animal because they feel like, oh, it looks like he's starving or whatever. And instead of taking it to the Humane Society, a lot of, like on Nextdoor, I'm hearing people pipe up and say when somebody finds a cat, not to take it to the pound or the Humane Society, they now say, oh, well, I know of a feral cat colony on such and such street. You can dump it there or take it there. They don't say dump it. But the problem is during that 1 year study, we also found that through the animal welfare groups that many of these cat colonies aren't dedicated, or they don't have people dedicated to that cat colony. So in most cases, people are just randomly dumping food sometimes when they have the availability. And so my question sort of also is how do animal welfare groups feel about cat colonies that don't have dedicated people tending to it? Could that colony not be completely removed? I mean, it seemed like originally when this TNR started, it was for the little old ladies who had like 30 cats in their backyards. And they knew that if they took the cats away, which was kind of a practice back then, that, you know, she'd be hiding it, or she wouldn't, in other words, she wouldn't participate in getting them neutered or spayed. And so, and now it's evolved into, you know, they're everywhere in communities, and it's kind of like just the standard thing. But how do they feel about a colony that isn't really being tended to on a regular basis? Is that a possibility that those could either be relocated or even humanely euthanized if no one really is caring for those cats, if they are indeed, and of course, adoption is always my first choice, but you know, I know that that can be difficult because a lot of them are, you know, a lot of animal shelters are full all the time. But I'm just trying to reduce the population. So these animals, these pets, I mean, they're social animals. I would love nothing more than to see them obviously being homed, but it seems like we don't look at that as an option. And it seems like we're also not looking at euthanasia as an option anymore. Is that the case? Is that what y'all are finding here?
I'm going to quickly comment on the, they're not cared for by anyone. And I wonder if they are, and it's just not known. There are a lot of groups of cats. I try not to say colony because I've been told that there's, you know, diversity, inclusion issues with using those types of terms, colonization and share, you know, that. So, you know, groups of cats that we are all learning from others, right? You know, whether someone is known is that, you know, is feeding them or not, like, are they getting food? And that's, you know, one of the benefits of having programs dedicated to managing these cats is that people aren't trying to do it like under the radar, you know, like it used to be. Like people are, if we see the scenarios where there are bans on feeding cats, so people will just go dump out a bunch of food and run away, and there's a bunch of food left there. So it's not done in a good way. But if it's allowed, you can manage it, and you can have best practices, and you can monitor it. And people are more likely then to say, oh, there's this new cat that showed up. I'm going to get him out of here and get him to the shelter. So I think sometimes, you know, I've worked with groups of cats that it took me years to find out who was feeding them. Like I knew someone was, but it ended up being like a random encounter with meeting someone in a restaurant that, and like totally out of it, like oh, now I know who is feeding all of these cats. As far as the question about removing, adopting, how that affects the population, John, you want to talk about some of your modeling research and that? Does that fit into it?
Well,
So is
yeah, that's
euthanization
a
not
whole,
even
that's a whole
an
other.
option?
Well, I mean, I feel like we have to be reasonably practical. And if we're gonna involve animal welfare organizations in this work, which makes a lot of sense in urban areas.
And then I'll ask him about doing that. Do you feel okay?
Yeah, I just didn't want to like screw.
And Jessica will be in here. She can help too. if there's any
Okay.
issues.
Thank you.
Download your PDF onto the desktop.
It's already downloaded.
Oh, sweet, it's already there.
Okay.
So just make sure we know where that's going. We're not
Is it-
looking at it through the internet.
It's not, it's through.
Okay.
I had put a folder together. The Urban Birds folder there, and I don't know. You just have to just do that to open it. No, I think it just, oh yeah, there you go. Okay. Oh, and then you can just minimize it again. It's the folder. This is. Oh, no. This computer's gonna finicky. And I'm a Mac user, so. Yeah. Let's see, did you put your presentation in the folder?
I didn't put it in the folder. I just opened it up and in.
Okay, his is already open, so he's the first one, so that's okay.
Did you close it out?
Should be down here. Wait, I didn't. Oh,
It should be in Acrobat.
I don't.
May I?
Yes. I'm like, I don't want to miss stuff up here. I used to be good at computers.
Send downloads. Bugger this.
So I was trying to figure out where to put the other,
Mhm.
or do we have the other, like, where are the other tops?
There.
So mine's loaded on there. I'm right after him.
And then we have 2 more before the lunch break. So people just are supposed to come during the break to load. A few people from this afternoon have already come. Those are just extra, but if you need.
Oh,
them,
where's the
just
tag?
make sure. Oh, right here. I'm gonna leave this here for a second until we still have, unless we still have people.
So I'll make sure you throw it on there.
Are we recording?
Yes, she started recording, right? She started it.
Wait, we still have to turn on the video, but we're,
Oh, okay.
I try and move the stuff into the folder, I guess. To make sure it's, all the talks are there.
Yeah, can we open that Urban Birds one? So
This is the folder. So
got, so his is open, mine is on there, it says 10:50.
Okay. good.
And then we've got
Turkey,
the
yeah.
turkey at 11:30, or no, 11:10.
11:10, yep.
And then do you have one at 11:30? Wild turkey occupancy
By
across the
who?
urban Madeline.
I don't know.
Don't
By
know that one.
Madeline Jamesa. I don't see one.
No. Could be a no-show. We could look on the desktop to see.
Yeah,
Yeah, we could
there's
look on
one
the desktop
hiding
to
here.
see.
Click on, maybe we'll just click on this, we can just see the list.
Are you the technical?
Yeah.
She's like, I'm supposed to be Madeline Jamsa, and it would be Wild Turkey would be the name.
Is there an angle? You think that maybe it's short for now? Probably. not.
No. Well, and some people have not shown up, so
Want to make sure mine's on the desktop.
Oh,
yours
yeah.
is, it's in that folder.
Because I'll be back for this one too. I
You
just
know
wasn't
what?
figured out.
I noticed everybody's using white screens, white backdrops, and like mine's blue. That's something.
No, you're fine. Your PowerPoint presentation, you're good.
Okay, because it's blue and it's, everybody else's is white.
Okay,
That
there's
was
this.
That was nice.
That way we can get started on time. I'm gonna go sit back here.
That folder.
Is our first speaker here?
Yes.
Right there.
Right here.
All right, and where yours is already open anyhow, so. Will this expand on here?
Sorry,
Will this expand on here?
go to edit, or sorry, view. The top. Top left,
Top left and left. View
full screen.
full screen, and I'll do this first.
What, see what
Record.
I do?
Start video.
Okay, we're ready to start. Everybody, welcome to the Urban Bird session. Our first presentation is by Henry Adams. It's on the history and future of an urban population of black-crowned night herons in Chicago's Lincoln Park.
All right, small and mighty crowd, thanks for being here. Yes, yes. So maybe we can even make this a little bit more interactive since it's a little bit of a smaller, more intimate crowd. But thank you for being here. My name is Henry. I'm a wildlife ecologist, educator, and illustrator with the Lincoln Park Zoo's Urban Wildlife Institute. I use they, them pronouns. I love anything that has to do with feathers and slimy or scaled critters. I have studied wading bird ecology for a good many years, as well as amphibian disease and conservation in Costa Rica and the Southeastern United States. But today I am going to be discussing a little bit about this beautiful species that is native to the majority of the world. In fact, sorry, I'm gonna snag this real quick. Okay. This is the black-crowned night heron. By show of hands, who is familiar with this particular bird species? So a good number of us, awesome. So I can kind of breeze through a little bit of more of this introductory information here. We already know that they are a globally distributed species. This is actually the most widely distributed heron species in the world. But despite that, they are actually considered to be endangered in the state of Illinois, as well as 6 other Great Lakes states, largely due to habitat degradation and the loss of their wetland habitats upon which they depend. This is a state map of Illinois depicting the change in land cover since the 1800s to present day. The process of colonialism and agricultural industrial development has severely degraded the state's biodiversity, as well as ecosystemic health and well-being. So basically we transition from all this, excuse me, I just scarfed down my bagel, so I apologize. All this beautiful forest ecosystem here, especially in the western and southern portions of the state. And all of this beautiful tan area is our native grasslands and prairies. We can see the distinct and drastic transition to this map over here depicting present day Illinois with that large abundance of yellow area, which is depicting agriculture. The pink is of course highly urban area. So this is the center of Chicago up here in the northeastern portion of Illinois. And then with just a little bit of remnant forest area, especially down here in the south. We have experienced upwards of 90% loss of our wetland habitats and upwards of 99% loss of our prairie habitats, which of course has negatively impacted the black-crowned night heron, depicted here in an illustration that I did when I started this position a couple of years ago. Again, I love drawing all things feathery, slimy, furred, etc. And of course, this has a large amount of implications for trophic and nutrient cycling within the Great Lakes state region, since this is an apex predator species. They're really important for those kinds of cyclings. However, one of the amazing things that I love telling this story for is that there's an extensive history of urbanization for this particular species, not only in Chicago, but throughout North America. There are long-standing populations of urban black-crowned night herons in New York City. I think since the 1920s, there's been a very robust population that settled in to the area of Manhattan. There's also very robust populations in Oakland, California, as depicted by this lovely illustration by T.L. Simmons, as well as Detroit, Michigan, and even here in DC. Amy Scarpinato, I believe, is one of the conservation researchers out of the Smithsonian. And she has done a lot of amazing work to characterize the movement and health of these birds within urban environments. And in Chicago, as depicted here, they began settling in Lincoln Park, this beautiful, highly urbanized, yet also green landscape in roughly 2007. And one thing that I want to make note of is that even though the northeastern portion of Illinois is the most urbanized area in the state, it is also one of the most biodiverse areas in the state. And I'll get a little bit more into that in a second. Since they settled in Lincoln Park in 2007, they have utilized a number of different spaces throughout this urban green area. They come to settle at the Star initially, as depicted here. Back in the day, prior to my arrival at the zoo, there was a lovely corridor of, I believe, ash trees there that we called the Allée. And they loved those trees for their nests. Though it did cause a little bit of public concern, considering that this is an enormously popular and very public accessible park. And so that can cause a little bit of a smelly, stinky mess down there. Unfortunately, those trees had to be removed, I believe, in 2014 due to emerald ash borer. And so that we see these birds starting to move to different areas down here, denoted by the circle, the Chicago History Museum, and then denoted here by the square, which is our lovely Lincoln Park Zoo, specifically the Pritzker Family Children's Zoo, which is where we have a lot of animals that are native to Illinois and North America in our care in that space. So I have been lucky enough to come into this position at the Lincoln Park Zoo with an enormous amount of wonderful data that has been collected by scientists who have come before me. Mason Vidino actually held my position back in the day before he got his PhD. And so he did a lot of the work that I myself enjoy now. So I get a really fun data set to play around with. And by no means am I a statistician, but I am a very visual learner and I love creating graphs to share not only with myself, but with my interns and with you all. So I wanted to show basically the change in proportion of this population at those three main locations throughout Chicago over the years. And we did exclude the years 2020 and 2021 because unfortunately, due to COVID-related reasons, we weren't able to conduct the robust population surveys that we try to hold ourselves to that particular standard. So we're omitting those for a second. I can tell you a little bit more about those after my talk if you're interested though. But basically you can see that in yellow here, this is the proportion of the population that's living within Lincoln Park, again denoted by this star areas, the Allée. And you can see that come 2010, the entire proportion of that population is staying there. And then around 2014, again, remembering that that's when the Allée was taken down because of emerald ash borer, we see that shift in population to mostly focusing around the Lincoln Park Zoo and the Chicago History Museum. And then the really exciting thing for us at the Lincoln Park Zoo is that in 2016, these birds started really prioritizing that area at the Lincoln Park Zoo, again denoted here in blue. So in 2016, they really shifted. The majority of that population began breeding exclusively, or sorry, majority of the population began breeding at the Lincoln Park Zoo. And then that they increased that proportion over the years. And then come 2022, we were finally able to do not only surveys at the Lincoln Park Zoo, but also just checking up on those areas that they were nesting at the Chicago History Museum to make sure that they still weren't using that habitat. So in 2022, we were able to confirm that, you know, by our ability to detect these birds, they were exclusively using the Lincoln Park Zoo's Pritzker Family Children's Zoo for their nesting habitat. And I want to bring up this wonderful urban green space project. So this is our nature boardwalk. And I'll get into a little bit about the population trends of these birds in just a second, but I want to make it very, I want to point out this really awesome piece of the story that, again, these birds came into Lincoln Park around 2007. And we started monitoring this population in 2010. In 2010, there was an enormous boom in population size as well as productivity. And I'll get into that in a little bit more in a second. But I want to bring up the Nature Boardwalk because this was an amazing project that turned this human constructed concrete and turf lined recreational pond into a flourishing urban wetland prairie ecosystem. And in 2010, the night herons, the monarch butterflies, many other species, we've documented over 300 different plant species and over 200 different animal species to utilize this space, including our in-state endangered black-crowned night herons. And so it's just a really fantastic part of the story that, you know, we're all trying to tell at this conference, right? That urban spaces, when designed with humans and wildlife in mind, can actually be these wonderful gems of biodiversity, remembering that even though the northeastern portion of Illinois is the most heavily urbanized place in the state, it is also the most biodiversely rich in the state. And it's in large part thanks to urban green space projects like the Nature Boardwalk's naturalization process. So I want to get into a little bit before we talk about some of the numbers and some of the research that I'm excited to be implementing with my team this year. I want to just talk a little bit more about the monitoring processes and practices that we implement at the zoo. These will kind of be bare bones details if you're interested in discussing more. I know Jessica and I have a lot to talk about, and I was very excited to hear their presentation after mine. So within the Pritzker Family Children's Zoo, they actually settled specifically above our red wolves, which Seth Magley, when he introduced the UN Symposium, was talking a little bit about mesocarnivore release. This is a pretty common thing that you see in colonial nesting wading birds, exploiting, it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg kind of thing. Did the wading birds come first? Did this apex predator come first? Who's to say? And at least in this instance, the wolves were absolutely here first before the herons. And oftentimes you see that these wolves can provide a little bit of protection to these birds. They allow, you know, they exclude nest predation and provide a little bit of security for these birds. We conduct censuses, again, 3 times a week to get that population data. And we provide a little bit of fencing and close down this area of the children's zoo to provide them with as much privacy as possible. And in some rare instances, we also do provide rehabilitation for these birds. So some of the population trends that we're seeing, we're definitely seeing, and not a particularly statistically significant, but a very, you know, a pretty nice positive trend in the growth of this population over time since 2010, which is very encouraging. But the even more encouraging thing is that we are seeing a significant increase in the productivity of this endangered colony since 2010. With a pretty statistically significant p-value that we're really excited about. And again, 2010 and 2022 are the 2 most productive years that we have on record, which is really exciting for us as, you know, a research and management agency or group. And remembering that 2010 was the year that the Nature Boardwalk was concluded, thinking that, you know, maybe that had something to do with the success of this colony overall. You know, and we want to make sure that we can, you know, understand why we're seeing these particular trends. And so to do so, we were like, okay, with more birds, with more juveniles, maybe it's just a product of there being more adults. We're seeing a general increase in the adult abundance over years. Though there is a very slight positive trend here, it's not particularly statistically significant by any means necessary. So there are other things besides adult abundance that are influencing the growing productivity of this colony. So what exactly are those things that are making this colony so productive, especially for an urban colony, the largest in the state of Illinois? So some of the major takeaways from this data is that we had a boom productivity year in 2010, maybe having something to do with Nature Boardwalk. The 2022 population was the largest on record. There were over 750 adults documented and 400 young of year detected. And this is clearly indicative of the success of a rare and endangered species within an urban environment, which is a really exciting conservation story to tell. Ooh, sorry, yeah. And we're really seeing that growing abundance between 2011 and 2022, and now the question is why? There's a small positive relationship between adult abundance and juvenile abundance, but it's not particularly significant. So does it have something to do with our management? We would like to think so, but we need more information, of course. Does that have something to do with habitat quality? All the beautiful things that are being discussed by all these amazing scientists discussing occupancy models and why animals live in certain areas over other areas, what sort of resources are they accessing, what sort of parasitic and predators are they able to, relationships are they able to evade being in urban areas? So again, more research is needed. And to that end, my team and I started banding the young of year birds last year. Again, I'm happy to get into more detail with you. I'm running out of time here, but please find me at lunch. I'm more than excited to discuss this more with you. We were able to band a number of individuals. Some of them went into the red wolf yard, which was a bit of an unfortunate situation. But we have at least 15 out there somewhere in the world, and we hope to recite them within a couple of years once they reach full maturity. I now manage a graduate student, and I'm the co-PI of a relatively large and growing research program that's focusing on continued colony monitoring, as well as the deployment of GPS transmitter units so that we can characterize their full annual cycle and movement. We want to continue public engagement work and basically try to understand what exactly is it about Lincoln Park Zoo that they are selecting for, and how are the different habitats they're selecting for in influencing their health. This is one thing that I don't think I have time for, but talk to me about the population trends of this year. It's quite interesting. And I'm really excited with my grad student next week to implement some of these walk-in traps and hopefully deploy some of these GPS transmitter units. With that, thank you so much to everyone on this page, all of my wonderful interns. I could not do any of my banding work without them. And I don't think that I have any questions or time for questions, but Oh, I'm so sorry. That was for the 15 minutes. Woo. I misunderstood. Oh, okay, fantastic. Well, yes, I'm going to go back and say thank you so much to these folks because they really do deserve so much wonderful credit. This is my suite of interns. I'm so lucky to be able to mentor 5 intern positions over the course of my summer. I have another 5 interns coming in with me to working with this amazing bird colony this summer. And Seth Magley, Mason Fedino, Liza Lara, Anna Case, everyone else at the Urban Wildlife Institute that has just provided so much immense support to me and everyone at Illinois Department of Natural Resources and University of Illinois. So yay, I do have some time for questions, so I can backtrack to some of those slides that I skipped over.
Part of this while the birds are nesting. What's
Yes.
their nesting period time? Like how long of time is that?
Yes. Yay, I can go back to this slide then. So this actually kind of characterizes that phenology. So typically we see, I know that's probably really hard to read from all the way back there or even two feet in front of it. They usually come somewhere around mid to late March. So this is data from 2022 and this is our data from 2023. They started coming back to the zoo around March 23rd last year. We saw a significantly earlier return to the children's zoo this year. They started arriving around March 16th. So a solid week and a half prior to that. And usually you can kind of see that we have a general nice, generally linear climb in adult abundance over the years over the days until they reach like a peak abundance sometime in early May. What the really cool thing is about this slide is that we're seeing a lot more adults returning a lot earlier, and we're seeing a lot more adults stay a lot longer, which is really exciting. And this is all hypothetical, of course, but thinking that maybe this has something to do with there are less transient individuals. Perhaps there are more individuals that are coming and actually successfully breeding. So I'm really excited to see what our final young of year counts are going to be this year. Thinking, you know, maybe we'll see even the most productive year on record this year. Who knows?
And do you get feedback from the community, like visiting the park, that, well, why is this closed down, and you know, we want to have access to that?
Yeah, that's a really great, really great question. So I'll direct your attention to this picture right here. So this is within the Children's Zoo. There is a small amount of pushback. Generally speaking, these birds are pretty well supported by the community. The Chicago birder community is deeply passionate about all subjects that they care about, including this black-crowned night heron. And so a number of our supporters, like the Chicago Black-crowned Night Heron Project and the Bird Conservation Network, have been helping try and track and capture these birds in order to deploy these GPS transmit units. So we do get a lot of support there. And when visitors come to the zoo and see that this area is closed down, typically when I'm doing my work, or when our volunteer staff, or when we have a lot of teen programs that provide, you know, interactive interpretation for this space and to talk about the black-crowned night herons, usually they come in, visitors are a little bit bummed, but then after even just a couple minutes of explaining the story of this endangered species thriving in an urban setting, they usually walk away, you know, at least displaying neutral to positive energy about it. Any more time for questions, or we're wrapping up? Thank you all so much.
So we have to share the screen. Who's up next?
Wait, where's the schedule?
Can you tell me the program to pull up?
Should be
the criteria.
Should be
Jessica. Right, now it's in Zoom now.
Oh, no. How do I?
Is yours on the desktop?
Yeah, that's her. That's her. Oh, goodness. You gonna jump up and walk with her?
Okay, our next speaker is Jessica Alderson. She's going to talk about criteria for implementing urban rookery management at the municipal level, a zoned management approach.
Awesome. Thank you, Lois. All right, thanks for joining me this afternoon or this morning still. So my name is Jessica Alderson. I am the Urban Wildlife Technical Guidance Program Leader for Texas Parks and Wildlife. I was an urban biologist for 15 years, and so I'm new in this position, only 2 months in. And so I have been working intensively with the city of San Antonio on looking at ways to better manage urban rookery populations that are popping up pretty frequently in our area. So Texas being located in the main central flyway zone, it's no surprise that we have an influx of birds coming through our state at any given time. And many of you, since you're in the bird session, you're interested, you probably already know what a rookery site is. But in case those of you that are new to talking about or learning about rookeries, I just wanted to let you know like what a rookery site typically looks like. So egrets and herons are colonial nesting birds, meaning that they naturally congregate in these large groups and nesting. A lot of people are under the misconception that, oh, it's just an overpopulation of them, but it's not. That's how they naturally like to nest. Consists of several species, including egrets, herons, and cormorants, and we'll go into those species that we typically see in San Antonio in just a minute. They like a closed canopy of about 75% or more because they want to make sure that their babies are protected during that nesting period from potential predators. They also like to have overlapping branches from tree to tree so that it makes it easier, especially those fledglings, those first few weeks before they can completely fly, can move from tree to tree and move around. And then they'll nest in various, I've seen these birds nesting in like mesquite trees, like at my hip width, or height, sorry. And so So yeah, they can nest pretty much in any type of vegetation, especially now that they're becoming more and more adapted in our urban communities. And then our nesting season, depending on the species, typically starts in March. And then the cattle egrets are usually the last to come in, and they wrap up their nesting time in October. So our span is pretty long when you're looking at the impact of a rookery, especially in an urban area. And the lifespan of a rookery can last anywhere from 1 to 12 years, but typically it's going to be about 5 years. Here are the species that we typically see in the rookeries that we consult on in San Antonio. So great egrets, snowy egrets, cattle egrets, and yellow-crowned night herons, and then also the little blue heron. The yellow-crowned night heron and the little blue heron are probably the least prevalent in these communities. The yellow-crowned night herons kind of like to be on the outskirts of the rookery, but then the cattle egret is really the most abundant species that we see. So for protection purposes, egrets and herons are protected by the federal protection for the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well as our state protection with our Chapter 64 Texas Parks and Wildlife Code. So it is illegal to try to cause injury, to kill them, to remove nests, to remove eggs. And so we do have that to think about when we're making management recommendations in our urban communities. So oftentimes, our rookeries are existing throughout the state, and we maybe don't even know that they actually exist unless the landowner calls us and says, oh my gosh, I suddenly have all these white birds at the back of my property. What are they doing there? What can I do? But we are seeing more and more people that are calling us within urban communities saying, oh, we saw a few white birds. And then a few weeks later, it's like, oh my gosh, now there's thousands of white birds. And what do I do? And how can I do this? And so oftentimes we get these phone calls after the fact, right? So these birds are already nesting at this point, and we're limited in what management recommendations we can provide for them. And so you can see there's an up close version there. You can see some snowy egrets in there, but most of these are going to be cattle egrets in this particular one. And then this is a picture looking up into the tree after the birds have gone. Usually our first cold snap, mid to late October, the birds leave and go for warmer weather. And so those are just the nests up there. So you can see how many of them are up in those trees. So what are some of the challenges that we deal with urban rookeries? You can see here, this is a picture in San Antonio at Brackenridge Park. That's a historical wall that lines the San Antonio River. And you can see it's just covered in feces, which is not a good thing from the city's perspective because they're trying to protect our historical features. You can see they're hanging out by vehicles during prime time for the cattle egrets during their prime breeding season, usually in June. We get a lot of calls of people saying, you know, there's cattle egrets walking in the road, people are hitting them. And so there's a lot of concern from the community. We do our best efforts of putting up signage to let people know, hey, this is an egret nesting area. They're protected. Please don't handle the birds, but it usually gets covered by feces. So we're having to replace those signs pretty regularly. We also have challenges when they come into our parks, especially park benches, unusable. We've got in playscapes. And so our Parks and Recreation Department in San Antonio does a fantastic job trying to keep up with cleaning all of this stuff so that we can offer these amenities to our constituents. But it's a lot of work, a lot of time, and it can become very challenging. And then, unfortunately, we have a lot of people that try to chase fledglings, or we'll get calls and saying that people are trying to pick them up and, you know, look at them because they think they're cool. And so we get lots of people calling concerned about that. Is there a disease risk? And then we also have to deal with the media. So we try to work really closely in the urban program with our local media contacts so that we can provide relevant and accurate information to the public. Sometimes it doesn't always come across that way. And so we try to work with them to get that information out there. And so you can see here, Birds Force Playground to close. This was at Brackenridge Park. And our big goal is that we want to prevent these types of things from happening. So 84 egrets killed after workers cut down protected bird nests in Texas. And this is not the one and only time this has happened. This happens more often than not. People will call and say there was a rookery here, and then overnight the whole thing is just bulldozed down. And we definitely don't want that to happen. So we want to work with our developers and with our community leaders to make sure that they're aware of what the regulations are and how we can help them in the future and be proactive rather than reactive. So again, this is Breckenridge Park. This is all historical buildings all along here. And so and this is just a very small portion of this rookery. So it extends all the way kind of a little bit more past the river. And so when you take an aerial photo and you look at Breckenridge Park, this is basically where they are all nesting. And so Breckenridge Park is over 300 acres, and they're all nesting in the primary use areas of the park. They like being around all of the people. They're nesting around buildings. They're nesting around the pavilion. Instead of choosing those sites like here, more ideal space for them to be more secluded away from people, right? And so the city contacted us and asked for some recommendations. So we gave them recommendations of public awareness and education. So we helped with those efforts, talked to them about the importance of early detection from areas that we don't want rookeries to establish. We talked about habitat modification and how they can modify those existing tree canopy covers to reduce the attractiveness of those local areas where the birds were trying to come in. We advised them to do old nest removal, which we can legally do, and then also advise them on visual and noise deterrence. So I can do a whole presentation just on those things. But we realized really quickly that the community was very passionate about the birds, right? And they didn't understand, well, why is the city trying to get the birds to leave? This is a park. Birds are supposed to be in a park. And I absolutely agree with that. And the park absolutely agrees with that. However, the city was having to close down pavilions, bathroom access, office buildings, playgrounds, because the birds chose to nest in an area that was highly usable by the community. So we were trying to discuss, like, how can we do better at trying to advise the city? And so we wanted to put together a plan, a management plan that would help guide the community and the city on how to properly manage the egrets, and then also provide outreach for the community. So we wanted to assist park managers in prioritizing wildlife management actions based on a thoughtful and intentional process. Because as of right now, they were just kind of like, the birds are here, let's do something, go. There was really no like thinking about it in the future, like, how are we going to do this? So what we have proposed to the city is to look at all the city managed properties that's in San Antonio. We have a lot of parks, and we have actual like parks, and then we have natural areas. And we want to look at those areas and put zones in those areas. So we look at park operations. So if a rookery were to come into, let's say, Breckenridge Park, where they have, we can pull up a map of Breckenridge Park and look there and say, okay, what if a rookery were to come in here, where would we want it? And where do we not want it, right? So we don't want them in areas that would impact park operations or the parks, the public ability to use the public amenities that are there. And then also to have help to mitigate human health and safety. So, thank you. So what we did was we wanted to also provide city staff and park managers and all of the existing partners with a level of predictability, right? And so the community was like, we don't understand what's going on and why are you doing this? This is illegal, because everybody knows about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So they're like, you can't do this. And so we wanted to make sure that it was all lined out there. It could be put up on the public website for the city, and they could read through it and know exactly what the city was going to be doing at any given moment based on this plan. And so it would line out the timing of management activities, the frequency, and the intensive management practices based on the zone that they would put out on a map. So the zones would indicate the level of impact created by the presence of the rookery. So we suggested a green zone, a yellow zone, and a red zone. So we go back to our map here. If we were going to try to map out Breckenridge Park and try to apply these zone management practices, we know that there's all these wonderful existing amenities that the park wants to protect. And so we would look at looking at the green zone, like, okay, let's look at this map and say, where could we have the birds? Because we want birds in our parks, but we just don't want them in certain areas that are going to negatively impact our amenities. So a green zone is defined as no impact to recreational use of the park, and the future colony growth does not present a human health or safety risk. So the management recommendations, and this would all be outlined in the management plan for the community to read. They'd say, okay, I look at this map, this is the green zone. If a rookery ends up in here, the city is not going to do much of anything. They're just going to continue to monitor. They can do normal property maintenance and mowing and weed eating and edging. They can, but they want to continue to monitor to make sure that that population doesn't grow over time, which sometimes they do. So for example, this could be a great area for green space. The birds could nest all in there and the city would be absolutely okay with that. Then you move to the yellow zone. A yellow zone is defined as an area that results in minimal reduction in recreational use of the park and or potential health or safety hazards that warrant regular monitoring. So this would be an area, for example, areas of the parks that have amenities with very limited use. So there was an area of the park in Brackenridge Park that was heavy tree canopy, and they had about 10 picnic tables underneath it. And so the birds moved in there and they were okay with it because they could take those, they just closed that area and said, this is a nesting site. And they took 10 new picnic tables and put them up in a temporary location elsewhere in the park. So it wasn't really a huge impact to public amenities and they could help to offset that. And that was pretty successful. So management recommendations in a yellow zone would be closely monitor for changes in size and abundance, increase cleaning and maintenance activities. So it could be, if you only have a couple picnic tables, you may be able to go in there and send your crew in there once a day or once every couple of days and just power wash the area, or if it's a path to a bathroom or something like that. Consider conducting habitat modification between late October and January to minimize the growth in the area, because we do know that they will potentially expand over time. And so if you monitor that and make sure that it doesn't potentially go into an area that we would consider a red zone, where we wouldn't want the birds to go. So continuing to monitor is super important. And then place temporary educational signage in that impacted area, which is where that photo came from with all the feces. So we had to keep changing those out pretty regularly, but it got the point across. So for example, here we go, we have our green area. And so maybe these areas would be areas of the yellow. So of course, we're starting to get a little bit close to some neighborhoods there and some parking lot areas. So it wouldn't be absolutely detrimental if they were to come in here, but it would be a time where we would want to be closely monitoring that and maybe do some habitat modification. And then last but not least, our red zone would be an area that results in a significant impact to the recreational use of the park, amenity, or could potentially cause public health or safety issues, or damage to a sensitive ecological feature. So we have a lot of karst features in San Antonio, and especially in our parks. And so if it's like right over a really sensitive area, we definitely don't want the birds to be there and then having all their droppings on that. So some management recommendations, and of course the examples of this would be your pavilions, your park, you know, the areas that are highly, highly visible and visited by the community. So for the management recommendations here, we would implement rookery management techniques, which would be those visual and noise deterrents, habitat modification, old nest removal, all the things that we discussed earlier. And then we would want to continue to monitor. So when you start applying these deterrent techniques, the birds have got to go somewhere, right? So we want to make sure that they're not going somewhere else that's just as undesirable, or push them into a neighborhood, which would be a really bad PR move, right, for the city. And so it's really important to keep those communications with the communities that are around these areas where these activities are going to be taking place, so that you can educate them on what to do if they start seeing 1 or 2 egrets pop up. Like, you need to let us know right away so we can get them to make sure that they're not going to be coming in and taking over your neighborhood. And then if the egrets and herons attempt to reestablish, then we want to make sure that we are trying to push them out of those areas. So for example, here we've got, which is where the birds are now, up here, this would all be considered a red zone. And then over here, because we've got parking lot space as well. And so, and it would definitely, each park would be different and it could be a lot more intricate. So, you know, let's say you have some amenities right here off this trail that are very high use, you could potentially integrate a red zone into a green zone. And so it doesn't have to be so just like kind of concrete, but I just wanted to kind of give you guys an idea of what we would be recommending. So one thing that you want to make sure to do is to evaluate nesting behaviors. So while you're doing management techniques in areas, and if birds are nesting in another location and you're trying to, let's say, defend a space like over by the pavilions, and they start nesting in one of those green zone areas, you want to continue to monitor those green zone areas to make sure the deterrent efforts, if you're using noise deterrence especially, is not having an impact on those already nesting birds. So you'll want to look for these different behavior, relaxed behavior, scanning, alert behavior, and flight behavior. If any of those things are occurring while you're applying your deterrent efforts in those red zones, then you're going to want to stop and reassess the situation. You may have to make that red zone a little bit smaller or kind of stop those management techniques at that time if it's having a negative impact on those already nesting birds. So that's super important. So implementation of the plan, it's already been reviewed and approved by the City of San Antonio Parks and Recreation and their city manager. And next step is to do some educational outreach about the plan and then present it for approval for City Council. The keys to success is constant communication with your leadership as well as people in the community. You want to make sure you build those partnerships with your local Audubon Club, other conservation liked organizations, and then other homeowners associations and all the surrounding landowners in the area. And then also try to make sure that you work really closely with the media so that we avoid this preparing for the egret invasion stories. And it can be more educational and purposeful information. So with that, I'm not sure that we have time. Maybe one question, Lois, one quick question. Thank you guys so much. Okay. Yeah.
So it's kind of two-part. So have we seen that it's successful to do this kind of gentle hazing in other places to get them to move? And is there anything aside from manipulating tree cover you can do to attract them to the green spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I know our local Audubon chapter is really wanting to try to do some attraction efforts where, so I know in Houston, they took some of those pink flamingos and they spray painted them white and put them up in the trees, and they had success with that. Now, I don't know how far of a distance. So the biggest challenge is how far are they going to go? Like usually you can move them like very short distances, right? Not very long distances. And so that's something to definitely consider if we're not wanting to move them. So like the distance between where the birds were there in Brackenridge Park and that big green space area really wasn't that far. And over the last 2 years, we've been able to slowly move them towards that area. So maybe once we get them going in the right direction, you could pop those up. And so we're hoping to do some urban rookery studies in San Antonio because this problem is not going away. It's going to continue to happen. So
Thank you.
yeah, thanks.
Is Mary Collins here?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
It was two turkeys, so.
Print here is so tiny. Okay, we got to move on. The next speaker is Mary Collins, and she's going to talk about Won't You Be My Neighbor? Wild turkey, Nulligris calopavo, occupancy in Washington, D.C. metro area.
Yeah, so thank you for coming. And we're gonna switch gears a little bit and talk about a bird that can fly, but not very well. And I'm a PhD candidate at University of Maryland, advised by Dr. Travis Gallo. We do have another turkey talk after this, so if you do like turkeys, stick around. And I will be presenting on the second chapter of my dissertation today. So just to introduce you to wild turkeys a little bit, this is their range map provided by the Audubon Bird Center. We are going to be focusing on the eastern wild turkey today, which you can see here in blue on the map. They are native to the central and eastern US. The little black square is our study area here in the DC metropolitan zone. And turkeys are considered to be diet generalists. They have a very flexible diet. They can eat anything from seeds to vegetation to insects. And habitat wise, they really kind of rely on both open habitat and forests. So they really like that edge habitat zone where they can roost in mature trees at night, but they also nest on the ground and lay their eggs on the ground as well. And according to the rural literature, there's not much information out there about urban wild turkeys at the moment. Their average home range size is somewhere between 1.5 to 3 kilometers. And here in the DC area, we actually kind of have an interesting story about wild turkeys. They were extirpated, especially from the state of Virginia in the early 20th century. A big effort was undertaken to reintroduce them to our area that ended up being extremely successful. And now the state of Virginia alone is estimated to have around 180,000 individuals. In the DMV, so the DC area, we started seeing turkeys around 2005, 2006. And really, we only have rural ecology research on this species. So urban research on wild turkeys is rare. And they have been making the both local and national news in the last couple of years. We are not the only city to see an influx of this species in urban areas. And they've been making the news for both good and bad reasons. So these are some headlines I just pulled from 2021, 2022, from turkeys in cities like Boston and Staten Island, around New York City, and I think Minneapolis as well, all had national stories come out in outlets like the New York Times. And the DC area is no stranger to having turkeys in the news over the last couple of years as well. This turkey in the first screenshot here from 2022 was notorious for chasing bikers on the Anacostia bike path down by the river, which prompted the National Park Service to put up some caution signs. And part of the problem is a lot of people that live in the city actually do not know that we have wild turkeys here. So when they see them, they're very confused about what species they are, how they got here. A lot of people will call in and think that wild turkeys that they see are actually like escaped from a farm or something like that. They don't realize that they're actually part of our urban ecosystem here. They've also made good press. So we actually have one of our study sites in Arlington National Cemetery last year. Probably around this time, our site contact there sent me this photo, and this photo went viral on Instagram as well, of this hen in Arlington National Cemetery following a funeral procession. And so she got a lot of good press in our area as well. So for our study, we set up 75 field sites across the DC metropolitan area. And we set up game cameras at each one of these 75 sites. So these sites include green spaces, mostly public parks. We also have cameras at cemeteries and golf course sites and recreation fields as well. And they were placed out for about 30 days each season. So spring, summer, fall, and winter for the 4 seasons out of the year. We have a photo database online, which some awesome undergraduates helped me ID all the species in each one of those photos. And they're triple authenticated, which means if there's a disagreement between 2 people, they'll come to me and I'll make the final decision of what that animal is to ensure that we are accurately identifying those species as best we can. And the data for this analysis I'm about to talk more about came from our camera traps from July 2020 and August 2021. July 2020 was the first season that we did this. So we conducted a occupancy model, a single season occupancy model across 4 seasons. I took a 2-kilometer buffer around each one of those 75 camera sites to kind of try to account for what we know is the home range for those turkeys, at least in rural studies. And then we chose some occupancy variables that we thought could influence turkey occupancy in our area, as well as some detection variables as well. So we wanted to look at those like bigger scale landscape level variables, like canopy cover, impervious surface, being in an urban area, low vegetation. We did roadways, water. We also did distance to roadways and distance nearest water body and distance nearest trail. So like the hiking trails in the park. We looked at canopy height, since that can be important for their nesting. We looked at elevation, human housing density to kind of take the people in the neighborhoods into effect. We looked at landscape entropy, so essentially the heterogeneity within the landscape, and we also included season as a categorical variable as well. For detection, we looked at temperature and average precipitation. We also looked at the number of camera days, since it varied a little bit when we first started putting the cameras out, to see if that had any effect on the detection probability of wild turkeys in our study. And we ran all possible combinations of these variables in a package called Dredge in R, which essentially takes every variable that we've chosen for occupancy and detection and runs a bunch of different models to see which ones kind of come up to the top, since we don't really have a great idea of how turkeys are using an urban landscape. And so camera trap wise, we detected turkeys during our study period at 19 sites. So those are denoted with the yellow dots here on the map. There were 6 in Virginia, 9 in Maryland, and 4 in DC proper. And we out of those in the different green spaces, 18 of them were in urban parks, and one of them was at a golf course in Arlington, which the guys that work there were constantly telling me when I showed up about the turkeys in the trees. And so for our results, again, we used Dredge, which looked at all combinations of our variables. We ended up having over 3,000 models due to this, and the top 25 models all kind of had the same variable combinations used in them. And so we used Delta AICC or Delta AIC within 2 to denote what our top model was. And since the top model, or since all the top models were kind of a variation of the same variables, we just went with the top model with a Delta AIC of 0 to interpret our results. And initially we had canopy height in this model as well as camera day and temperature for detection. But when I looked at the confidence intervals of all of these variables, the only ones, that did not overlap 0 were nearest roadway and elevation. So distance nearest roadway and elevation came out as the most predictive variables for occupancy within our study. So there could be a lot of reasons why these 2 rose to the top. We saw a strong correlation between occupancy and distance to roadway. So essentially how close the camera was to a road. The further the camera was from the road, the more likely we were to see turkeys on that camera. This could have been kind of a byproduct of where we put our cameras out. However, our cameras being in an urban area, I don't know why this is changing by itself, were pretty close to roadways in a lot of instances. Some of our parks were pretty big, like Rock Creek Park. A lot of people know that up in northern DC, but then we had a lot of pocket parks within our study as well. And we also saw elevation rise to the top as a significant variable. So the higher the elevation, the lower the probability of occupancy in our study. And DC is kind of an interesting habitat area. When you look at an actual elevation map, you can see that the Anacostia and the Potomac rivers, which are the 2 main water body systems that run through our study area, those areas actually have a lower elevation overall. So the positive correlation with distance to roadways, this could also be because turkeys are avoiding areas with really high anthropogenic noise and activity. If you've ever driven like on the outer belt or anywhere through DC, traffic is heavily congested in a lot of areas, including Alexandria and Arlington, where we also have cameras, and in Southern Maryland. So turkeys could be purposely avoiding these areas. I know in rural studies, sometimes right of way on roadways tends to come out as good habitat for turkeys, but we're not really seeing that necessarily be the case, at least not here in the DMV in our urban area. And the negative correlation again with elevation could be because these turkeys are attracted to the benefits that riparian corridors can provide. We see in a lot of other studies kind of across the board with wildlife, riparian zones around rivers can really provide a lot of not only habitat, but like food resources. They could provide kind of a refuge from that anthropogenic sound and activity. We have some protected areas along both of our rivers as well. And a lot of work has been, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of work has also gone into restoring the riparian areas around the Potomac and Anacostia River within the last decade or so, which could come out in the wash as helping increase the habitat area in these, or on these river systems for turkeys as well. So there are tons of directions that this research could go in the future. And this is just really like a first step towards getting some information on how these animals are starting to use an urban landscape. Doing a literature search to write up this paper into a manuscript, I had a really hard time finding anything published to kind of compare my data to and see if there were similarities or differences. So if you have grad students or somebody that wants to do a project in your city, and if you're in the Eastern or Central US, there's a lot of directions you could go. Comparison of cross cities would be really interesting to see how DC might deviate or be similar to occupancy variables or across cities. In my opinion, vegetation probably plays some sort of role in turkey occupancy as well. That's not something we really looked into at a finer scale, and that could definitely be done. It would be really interesting to see like GPS tracking for home range, to see how home range differs between urban and rural birds, and also see movement. How are they moving around the cityscape? We do know that observationally, they're using a lot of backyards from the press, picking up people taking pictures of turkeys in their backyards and asking, what is this? Yeah, so I have a lot of people to thank for this. Of course, if you want to talk about urban wildlife or turkeys in general, please reach out to me either at the conference or this is my email. You can always reach out afterwards as well. Thank you to my advisor, Dr. Gallo, my committee members, my lab mates in the Urban Nature Lab at UMD have all been awesome in supporting my research. Our undergrad researchers really have made this possible with 75 camera sites and anywhere between 50 and 3,000 photos per camera per season. I would not be able to ID all these by myself. So I really appreciate their help as well. And of course, the land managers that have provided access and allowed us to put these cameras out have all been awesome. A lot of them are pretty heavily invested in seeing what we see on the cameras and wanting to know more information about the animals that are using the parks that they manage. Big thanks to Dr. Katie Edwards and also Scott Bates for helping with the manuscript editing and revision process. I'm happy to say that this has been submitted, is now under review. And thanks to everyone who now constantly, I have a lot of friends who send me turkey memes and crazy urban turkey videos. So I really appreciate those and please keep them coming. Yeah, and I will take any questions. I think that we have time. Plenty of time. I apologize that my slides kept going forward. I did not realize that was on an automatic timer. They are, thank you. So again, because we lack so much information on how this specific species is using urban areas in the cities that they're starting to move into, I don't know what it's like in other areas, but this is our distribution map. The yellow dots are where we've seen turkeys on our cameras from 2020 to 2021. Like they're they can go up to Canada, yeah, according to the Audubon map. We have them really heavily, definitely in the Midwest, and it looks like, you know, their range can stretch up through Michigan as well. So they seem to do okay in the winter. I'm from Ohio and we have a ton of them there. And we definitely see them active on our cameras during the winter season, even if there's like snow on the ground or if it's really cold outside.
I wonder if they've been the same for wild turkeys. I mean, do you have any roughly date exists and
If people are hunting them?
breeding grounds for turkeys for hunting?
Not in an urban area that I'm aware of, but yes, I think that there are specifically areas kind of outside the city that are managed for wild turkeys, which could be potentially a source population of like where they're coming down into DC from. I can think of one up in Maryland off the top of my head. It's like McKee-Bescher's wildlife area that's specifically managed for deer and turkeys. Because yeah, they are an extremely popular game species. I grew up with hunters in my family that hunted wild turkey. And I think it will be really interesting to see if their populations persist and continue to proliferate really heavily, if there will be in the future anything that needs to be implemented to manage them, similar to white-tailed deer. They are a game species, so they're not protected under the Migratory Bird Act. Yes.
Sounds like the selection of sites was more pointing at those sites based on what you guys know. Were you planning to use like a hierarchy method or a random method?
For how we selected our camera sites? Yeah, so this study wasn't initially supposed to be just about turkeys. So for my dissertation, I'm doing a lot of like landscape level analysis as well for other species. So we pick up everything on these cameras. We did like a random selection to look at green space and randomly selected green spaces essentially through a model in R, and then wherever we could get a permit close to that green space, we ended up putting a camera. So yeah, we did not specifically select areas where we thought there would be turkeys. We just selected a random, like essentially this random grid of green spaces across DC. And when we put the cameras out, we did try to look for signs of wildlife, like game trails, put the cameras near in parks and things like that for just a better chance of detecting wildlife in general, but we didn't set out to select habitat that would be like specific to wild turkeys. You're welcome.
Okay. Thanks, Mary. First of all, I love your title. I think you might have the best title of all the talks here. And somebody already touched on the hunting aspect, but I was curious if you had any roadkill data that you were using, or if that was anything that you had access to.
No, we don't have any roadkill data that I'm aware of. I don't know if the state tracks that specifically. I think they mostly track like bag limit numbers across like Virginia, Maryland, that actually have like open seasons for turkeys, but I don't really know anything about the road mortality numbers. If they're avoiding roads, like it came out in the wash in our study, hopefully that means there's a less of a chance that they're going to get hit by cars. But yeah, I know in other cities, just from reading again, like major news outlet information, like sometimes that is a problem. I don't know that it's been necessarily like a big problem in our area yet. If the population increases, I guess it could become problematic alongside that, but yeah, I'm not sure about the road mortality numbers.
My experience in Indiana, more often than not, people are like stopping and not wanting to hit the turkey than they are actually like flying into it and like feeding them on the roadways. Like happy mascot on the road, but they don't want to hit more so than it is.
Speed up for the deer, but slow down for the turkey.
I mean, when you have a 60-pound bird coming at you, like I might slow down too. Thank you. All right, sweet.
Yeah, couldn't find it on yours. Yeah, I uploaded it in the wrong. Oh, wrong one.
All right, our next speaker is Madeline Jamsa.
Jamsa, yes.
All right, okay. We're going to talk more turkey. Wild turkey occupancy across an urban rural gradient in Montgomery County, Maryland.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Jamsa, and I am a second-year master's student at the University of Maryland. And if you enjoyed Mary Collins' talk, I highly encourage you to stick around because I will be discussing something very similar. However, it varies quite differently in its spatial scale. So my research focuses on quantifying eastern wild turkey occupancy across an urban-rural gradient in Montgomery County, Maryland. So the big question is, why study urban turkeys? Anecdotally, there has been a decline of turkeys in their more agricultural and rural habitats, and we know that they have historically occupied these areas. It is also estimated that wild turkeys are influencing the load and abundances of different tick species. Therefore, it's important to understand wild turkey populations in the terms of zoonotic disease spread. It is also estimated that wild turkeys are experiencing a potential range contraction to include these more urban and suburban areas. However, their reasoning for selecting these habitats remain poorly understood. So I would just like to ask the crowd a quick question now is how many of you have seen or experienced an urban or suburban turkey for yourself? Just a quick show of hands. I know Mary chatted briefly about them accosting individuals on the Anacostia bike trail, and I have seen one pretty recently driving on the Garden State Parkway. So it seems like just about everyone in the room raised their hand. So they seem pretty present in these urban and suburban ecosystems. However, there is very, very little research about urban turkeys.
So the objectives of my study are to analyze wild turkey presence and how this relates to tick densities, which leads me to my second objective is how does the presence of turkeys impact the spread of zoonotic diseases, specifically tick-borne diseases like Lyme disease and anaplasmosis? And what does this mean when we have turkeys, ticks, and humans coexisting in the same community? However, this study focuses primarily on this third point, which is urbanization, to see how the presence of wild turkeys is impacted by differing rates of human development. So my study area is Montgomery County, Maryland. For those who are not familiar with this area, it lies just north of where we are now. And this area is pretty central to the state of Maryland. However, it experiences high rates of urbanization in order to account for its growing population. So this is Maryland's most populous region, and approximately 1.5 million people reside in this region. Roughly 1/3 of the entire state's population just reside in this county. So in order to monitor wildlife populations in this highly urban area, the Applied Spatial Wildlife Ecology Laboratory at the University of Maryland has deployed 98 wildlife cameras across 8 spatially unique parks that vary in their rate of urbanization. So this is a close-up of Montgomery County, and I apologize for those in the back, it might be hard to see. In red are the location of my cameras. Those were randomly selected in ArcGIS. And we have approximately observed turkeys at all of the parks except for one. So these are the distributions of 8 different parks in Montgomery County. Towards the southern end of Montgomery County, the region that borders Washington, D.C., this area is classified as highly urbanized, and its green spaces are often discontinuous and spatially fragmented in nature. However, as you move towards the more northern end of Montgomery County, these areas are continuous and are more rural and agricultural in classification. So in order to analyze wild turkey population across this urban-rural gradient, I conducted an occupancy analysis to see how wild turkey occupancy varies with land cover data at differing spatial scales. So an occupancy analysis is essentially the combination that the wild turkey is present on the landscape with the probability that a wild turkey was detected. And so for this, I collected data from the first week of June and the first week of July of summer 2021 to provide me with a total of 14 different detection days. So land cover data was extracted from a 100-meter radius of the camera. This is because an approximate detectable range of the camera is 100 meters out from the camera. I also extracted land cover data from an approximate turkey home range around the camera, which is about this 0.53 kilometer buffer. So these different land cover variables at these differing spatial scales was utilized to analyze if wild turkeys were selecting for habitat at a small or large spatial scale. So here's an example of one of our parks. This is Muddy Branch. It's one of our more suburban parks in the study. And as you can see, the wild turkey home range exhibits a much larger spatial scale when compared to the 100-meter radius around the camera trap. Land cover extraction was done in ArcGIS utilizing the zonal histogram tool. So for building my occupancy covariates, I built covariates that accurately reflect wild turkey ecology. So I generated a food variable that encompasses the presence of cropland and pasture hay data because we know wild turkeys like to feed on these herbaceous vegetation. And the habitat variable encompassed their roosting sites, which accounted for the presence of canopy as well as forest. And then I threw in a water covariate in there as well. And then the impervious variable sort of classified how these areas were impacted by human development, which included the presence of roads, structures, and impervious surfaces classified as other in this data set. My occupancy covariate was ordinal day, and I hypothesized that as the presence of food increased on the landscape, occupancy would increase as well. So for my analysis, I utilized the unmarked package in RStudio. And I generated approximately 36 different models that included various combinations of that impervious habitat, food, water variables that I previously discussed. And ultimately, the model selection function was utilized to determine the best fitting model, and the best fitting model would have the lowest AIC score. So as for my results within the 100-meter radius of the camera, the best fitting model was the cropland variable, a standalone, and this yielded an AIC score of 62.04. Within the home range radius of the camera, the best fitting model was this combination of the food and water presence, and this yielded an AIC score of 63.36. And so I thought this was interesting because we know animals typically select for the presence of these big three, which is shelter, food, and water. However, wild turkeys don't seem to be selecting too much for habitat in these models. As I previously mentioned, the best fitting model is the one with the lowest AIC score. So out of all the models ran, cropland within a small scale region is the best fitting model for my data set. As I previously mentioned, best fitting model was the cropland one. Therefore, wild turkey presence can best be explained by cropland habitats at a small spatial scale. However, do these results really reflect what we know about wild turkeys and what we hypothesize about urban and suburban turkeys? And to that question, I tell you maybe, because as Mary previously mentioned, we know that they are habitat generalists, and these models and these results may be inferencing that they are more selective when picking their areas when they're actually really quite not. So in order to better understand wild turkey occupancy across this urban-rural gradient, future analyses must be conducted. I plan to conduct an occupancy analysis for all adult females, males, as well as poults to see how occupancy varies across age and sex structure. I also will be including more data in this analysis as well. I will be collecting data from the both fall and spring seasons to see how wild turkey occupancy varies seasonally. We will also be adding more images to this data set. Currently, the Molinax lab is sitting around 700,000 images in our data set. It takes a lot of time to process these images. While I will only be utilizing a subset, this is all images are manually identified. Additionally, we will be adding other site-specific covariates, as well as site-specific vegetation and urbanization metrics to possibly analyze how the presence of wild turkey might vary at this microhabitat scale. And I would just like to thank a few people. I would like to thank everyone at the Applied Spatial Wildlife Ecology Laboratory at the University of Maryland, the people from Montgomery County Parks for letting me place camera traps in their parks, and the USDA Agricultural Research Services. And thank you all for listening. I was quick because I know it's lunchtime and it's the third day of the conference. So yes, if anyone has any questions or a job offering in 2 years. Yeah, up front. Yeah.
I saw some the other day.
We have added quite a few images. We have added quite a few cameras to Rock Creek Park. So in this analysis, I believe I only had 6 cameras at Rock Creek, but now we have 25. So we have quite a few, I would say quite a few in Rock Creek. I can't give you any specific numbers, but they show up, they're pretty present in that data set. Yeah. Anything else? Sweet, go get lunch.
You have to stop sharing here. I will not be in the middle, but I'll be back at the end. But I will be here.
Did we stop the recording?
This is close. Stop sharing. So do I do stop share here?
Yes. And let me know. You can just pause recording. There we go. Yeah.